There.
Hey, I can hear you.
Great. Do you want to? I have enabled screen share, so if you want to see if your presentation comes up okay.
Oh yeah, let's see. Um, I'm more familiar with the Google Meet share screen. That work?
Yep, there you go.
Great. All right. Well, it's a big
It's turned.
invite list. Will we have, will everyone attend, you think?
Yeah, we normally get a pretty good turnout. What's nice is there's a mix across the states as well, from whether it be more practitioners versus academics as well, regulatory bodies. And I think this topic had a lot of interest just because there's a lot of states at different phases when it comes to doing the restoration work or living shorelines work. And I think my big push was to get as many people in this space that potentially don't have an SAV background as well, so that it can kind of guide potential future research angles, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's me. I do not have a SAV background. Formally, informally I do, but yeah, so it's cool to be a part of the conversation.
Definitely. We're glad to have you. I'm glad that Brooke was able to get you on the schedule.
Yeah. And where
So
are
what's
you?
I'm in New Jersey.
Oh, cool.
So
Okay.
about 2 hours south of New York City and an hour east of Philadelphia.
Gotcha. All right.
Good
Hey, Brooke.
morning,
Good
Brooke.
morning. Good morning. Can y'all hear me okay?
That
Yeah,
can.
sounds good.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
So while people are filtering in, if you can put your name and your affiliation in the chat. We do record our quarterly meetings and post the minutes from those. And so we'll have a running list of who was in attendance today. Morning, Judd, Phil, Paul. Nice to see you guys.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hey, Z.
Yes,
So we are not going to have somebody from North Carolina for the regulatory portion,
I saw
but
that. Just,
Megan,
yeah,
yeah, we've got Megan and she's got a couple slides too. So just
perfect.
FYI.
I
And
don't see
Jesse won't
either
be on till
till later.
9:50. Yeah.
Yeah. Morning, Jill.
Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Sam, did you go to Ray as well? Were you there?
I did. Yeah, I was there for the first 3 days.
Okay. It was
Um,
jam-packed.
oh my gosh. Yeah, so much content. That's my only gripe is there was just so many concurrent presentations going on. I felt like I was like just FOMO, for 3 days. Um,
Yeah.
but but yeah, some really great stuff.
Yeah, I think what there were 12, there was 12 sessions, I think, at the same time, concurrent sessions, and that was a bit overwhelming to try and
Is it
be in so
always
many
like that?
places.
This
Pardon?
Wait, is it always like that? That was the first Ray I'd ever been to.
I
There's
think it
normally
was,
a lot of sessions. Yeah. Brooke,
Yeah.
you've been before?
I have. It's been a few years. The last one I went to was the one at National Harbor. So probably, oh my, it was probably 10 years ago now, actually. But there was a lot going on at that one too, even back then.
Yeah, I
And
pretty
next
much just
year it'll
went
be.
to every living shoreline, you know, one. And I learned a lot. There's a lot going on. It's a change. The industry's changing quite a bit, it seems like.
Hence the reason this was such a high interest. There's a lot of moving parts, but a lot of science that's happening that isn't published yet. It's kind of like these little pilot studies.
Right.
So it was a good forum just to do the informal connections too between the sessions.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, and a lot of collaboration between states, which is neat to see as well.
Yeah, some of the panels in particular. So if you're just joining us, if you can put your name and your affiliation in the chat, helps us know who you are. Morning. See some more faces. Jamie, Aaron, Josh. Nice to see you guys.
Good morning.
I don't see either Megan in the chat or in the group yet. Do you, Brooke?
No, I was just looking. Not yet. I sent her the agenda and she knows when she's on, so she might not be able to join until then. I'm not sure.
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. If you are just joining us, if you just entered the space, please put your name and affiliation in the chat. I'm Elizabeth Lacey, or Z, and I'm here with Brooke as two of the three trifecta with our fearless help, Caitlin, as well, for the East Coast SAV Collaborative. She helps keep us in line. So today the topic is living shorelines and impacts with SAV. And so I want to welcome you all. I definitely spread the message as wide and far as I could because there's been a lot of interest, obviously, in what each state is doing, kind of the advancements that have been made thus far and where some of the science sits. But one of the deliverables we're hoping to come out of this is an idea of where the science could be headed next. What are some of the gaps? So a couple brief announcements when it comes to the East Coast SAV Collaborative. Where's my agenda? So we did our last quarterly meeting. The topic was SAV and aquaculture interactions, and so Jill was gracious enough to share the survey that she had put together and that she's been working on in Massachusetts. And so we then populated that into a Google form because, us, we like our Google forms, and sent that out. And there really wasn't a lot of interest or connection with further expanding those survey responses. And so we've decided as kind of the core team here to table it for now. We can certainly revisit SAV and aquaculture interactions. It doesn't mean that it's not a topic that wasn't expressed as an interest. It just interest has waned potentially, and we're leading towards a different direction. So we're going to table that for now and continue on with our next planned meeting. So the January meeting, Phil, you'll be happy to know, will be about creating a common definition of the seagrass meadows. This was something that we discussed previously. There is a running Google Doc with if there are state definitions existing, what you operate under when you're defining what a seagrass meadow is, /bed /fill in the blank, right? So what we're going to attempt to do in that meeting is actually pin that down and come up with a recommendation from the collaborative so that it can be widely accessed. Again, on the EC SAB collaborative website, which we can put in the chat, all of the resources are there. So anything that has been the product of one of our quarterly meetings, as well as the recordings from the quarterly meetings. So if you want to get caught up in the past year and a half plus of our meetings and our work here, it's all available on the website. But that will be the January meeting. So stakeholders as well. We have 2 stakeholders from each state. If you're new to East Coast SAV Collaborative, there's 2 stakeholders for each of the states. And then we bring that back to a general meeting. We are looking for a couple representatives from the states. And then as well, if you've been on the committee as a stakeholder and you're ready to rotate off, let us know. But that will be first a stakeholder meeting to discuss the process for the January meeting. And then following that January meeting, the last item from our original wish list of meeting topics, we were looking at mitigation. So that will be, as I said, the March meeting. Also at the January meeting, we'll be doing a similar population of the topics for the next coming year. So certainly make sure you're in attendance if you want to help steer where we're headed. So steering committee members, sorry, not stakeholders. So if you want to have a role of steering where the East Coast SAV Collaborative will be for next year, 2025, crazy enough. Please make sure you attend that meeting and chime in with some of your thoughts on those additional topics. So those are the announcements that I have. Am I forgetting anything, Caitlin, Brooke?
Just to point out, so there are a lot of folks on this call that aren't, part of our member list. So thanks for joining. But if you would like to become a member, you are more than welcome to. So there is a Google form on our website. You get your picture on our wall if you submit one. So feel free to join and, keep coming back. And I think It looks like Phil's got his hand up too.
Great, Phil.
Can I just put in a shameless plug for Zosterpalooza, which is March 26th next year? If people are interested in attending and or speaking, please reach out to me and let me know.
And we can put that on our event calendar as well. And any details that you have, if it's a link that you're willing to post, or once you have the agenda, I know you normally send that out. Thanks, Phil. Awesome.
All right. Don't see any other hands.
Great. So we're a little ahead of schedule, which is never a problem. So if we want to kick things off, we've invited Sam Eckert to come in and give us kind of an introduction to Living Shorelines, just to cover some of the nuts and bolts and background of, what composes a living shoreline. And I realize that because we do have a new mix of folks in on this meeting versus our normal strong SAV contingent, some of you may have different of opinions in how you define living shorelines or some of the structures that are used. But really, this focus is just to kind of give a brief overview to set the stage for the subsequent conversation as SAP interactions with living shorelines. So Sam, welcome aboard.
Awesome. Thanks, C. And I definitely want to be a member of the collaborative. That's exciting. Yeah, thanks, Brooke, for inviting me to speak to this group. I'm honored and humbled and among this group. So I work for Maryland Department of Natural Resources in the Shoreline Conservation Service. And before this job, I actually worked for a marine contractor that built a lot of, they designed and built a lot of living shorelines and stream restorations and wetland restorations. So I'm kind of coming from the practitioner side, implementation side of things. And then before that job, I actually worked for Chesapeake Bay Foundation in their environmental education department. And with that job, I was able to live out on Tangier for close to 2 years, which is adjacent to some pretty robust SAV beds. I think it's Zostra and Rupia. And, spent a lot of time snorkeling and fishing in those SAV beds, pulling seine nets. So yeah, that's kind of my background with SAV. See, I guess I click here to advance. Oh, yeah. All right, so the Shoreline Conservation Service. So established in 1968, and the program provides technical and financial assistance to waterfront property owners experiencing erosion. The technical assistance is provided through site evaluations, assessments, and recommended solutions. So me and one other coworker, we go around Maryland and we get a lot of calls for shoreline erosion. And we basically meet up with those homeowners and get the process started, help them kind of figure out what the problem is. Sometimes it's a perceived problem. Sometimes it's really not that bad. And we just have to kind of coax them through, this is okay. Everything looks all right. Sometimes there's critical infrastructure like homes or driveways or roads, and that does need work done. And so we go through that process. And we can also offer through this program a zero interest loan for non-structural living shorelines. And there's a photo at the bottom right of a living shoreline project. I think that one's on the West River. It was not built in 1968, but it has been there for a while. And yeah, pretty cool project. So shorelines in Maryland, and I am going to be talking mostly about living shoreline work in Maryland, but I have some slides from, I think, North Carolina and Delaware, but I don't know as much about that. So we have about 6,659 miles of shoreline in Maryland. So quite a bit of shoreline, and 85% of that is privately owned, which I think is a really important point to make, that a lot of this work is being done on privately owned land. And 50% of Bay tributary shorelines are hardened. Now, this one, I didn't fact check this. I tried to, but I could not verify that that's a legitimate statistic. But from personal experience and knowing a couple different rivers, kind of near us in like near Annapolis, the Severn River, the South River, the Magathie, if any of you have been on those rivers, you know that they are significantly hardened with bulkheads and revetments, and maybe close to 80%. So it could be, and then you have like Baltimore Harbor and certain tributaries like that. So it could be that some are closer to like 80 or 100% hardened, and then some are closer to zero. But the point is, there's a lot of shoreline privately owned, and a lot of it is already hardened. So what do we do now? Erosion is constantly happening because of water, waves, and wind. And then this process is exacerbated by sea level rise, as we know. So that's a big topic surrounding living shoreline and designing living shorelines as well. Human activities, such as boating and then hardening those structures, can actually increase the rates of erosion on unprotected shorelines. So yeah, this is something we need to think about too, as we put those hardened structures in. Where are we making the problem even worse? That being said, erosion, it's not actually always that bad, right? So it's a natural process. Erosion in certain places can maintain and restore beaches or marshes and offshore habitats. And that's something I think I want to hear somebody talk about, is the key that erosion plays in SAV beds. That's a really interesting topic to me. So the health of the ecosystem really depends on it. And I will warn you, my presentation is very photo heavy. I love visuals. So this is from this year. This is a site visit that I went to. And this actually wasn't the site. There's a living shoreline that was put in kind of close to this, but I had to take a photo of it because it's somewhat of an alarming photo. But as I was saying, erosion is not always a bad thing. There's no house there. There's really nothing wrong in my mind looking at this. The trees are falling in the water, but let's take a look a little further down. So this is just a photo a little bit further down. We start to see less erosion. We start to see kind of a stable toe of bank there with those trees growing pretty well. And some sandstone boulders actually falling out of the cliffside, which is cool to see. And then a little further down, we see some trees in the water, but even less erosion, and those trees create good habitat for fish. And then we see a nice beach at the very end with some high marsh. So this is kind of that very dynamic coastal processes that we want to be aware of. When we go and work on these shorelines and we change those dynamics, it could really have a crippling effect on another ecosystem on either side of it. So just something to be aware of. So our traditional approaches to erosion, boom, there you go. Revetment on the left, and then a wooden bulkhead. And it does a good job of stopping that erosion for a certain amount of time. But what we see is a lot of negative effects coming from this. We're essentially severing that connection of land and water and all those critical ecotones that are in that intertidal zone. By putting these structures in, we can actually increase wave energy in front of those structures, which I believe can have an effect on SAV. Clearly the whole buffer area moving back from that, this person likes lawn apparently. Most people with bulkheads and revetments do like lawn, so we're really not doing any stormwater management and really no habitat. So pretty much wiping out any habitat potential with these structures. How do they fare over time? Well, sometimes not so well. They're really strongest on their first day when they're installed, and every day after that getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And it could be one, they're built to a certain level of strength, and it could be one storm that kind of pushes it over the edge and is that tipping point and causes that failure. It could be sea level rise that jeopardizes that structure, but ultimately they all have a lifespan. So yeah, this is just kind of comparison, gray versus green, strongest on its first day when it's put in, whereas a nature-based solution is kind of weakest on its first day, which is a weird thing to say. But as those natural components of that shoreline grow and become stronger, it provides more robust protection over time. So this is kind of our evolution, right? We're going from revetment, rock to natural green approach there. And we'll look at that shoreline a little bit later. So this is our definition for a living shoreline. And as you said, see, many people have their own definition, but living shorelines are a suite of techniques used to reduce erosion and enhance habitat by restoring and or enhancing natural features while maintaining coastal processes. And coastal processes, that's a broad term, but that's the sediment dynamics. That's all those interactions, right, that happen right there in that tidal zone. Features may include marshes, beach strand, headlands, groins, sills, offshore breakwaters, tombolas, cobble, shingle, beach, woody vegetation, and debris. And I'm going to show some photos of those different components. When designing a living shoreline, what are we kind of considering? So fetch, how much open water we have up to that shoreline, orientation and wave energy, so the potential for wind-driven waves to build up and hit that shoreline. And the orientation kind of, we want to think about what times of year. Is it in the winter where we're going to be getting stronger winds out of the north? Is it in the summertime where we're going to get kind of more consistent southerlies, at least in the Chesapeake Bay region? Salinity, what type of habitats are we going for? In the Maryland portion of the Chesapeake Bay, we have a huge gradient of salinity going from, salt all the way up into very fresh in those northern, northern rivers. So what type of habitats are we really trying to create here based on the salinity? Is existing substrate, sediment transport, where is that sediment going? Is it going to a neighboring wetland that we want to, or a beach that we don't want to necessarily cut off the sediment supply? Is it going towards a navigable channel? For example, this one has a boat ramp. So maybe we do want to try and catch sediment before it goes into that boat ramp area and fill in that boat ramp area. Water depth, slope, shading, existing land use, upland drainage, other resource impacts. So again, like neighboring wetlands, SAV in the area. So this on the bottom right there, that's a survey of a living shoreline. This is the Assateague living shoreline which is on the north side of the Assateague headquarters there, down near Ocean City. And this project was built right up to historic SAV beds to stay out of that. So what other resources are we impacting? And what are the project goals of this project? What's our budget, property ownership, et cetera. So there's a lot of different components. This, I believe the Army Corps made this image, or I think I took it off of the Delaware DENREC website. They have really, really good outreach material. But this is kind of a sliding scale of structure on the right, or what we consider gray, all the way to the green kind of softest approach to a living shoreline. And we're going to go through some photos of what that looks like. So starting on the very kind of softest approach possible, using just vegetation, this is awesome. If we could just do this everywhere, this would be amazing. But this is kind of low marsh, Spartina alterniflora, doing a really good job of locking up that sediment and encouraging those coastal processes, habitat, carbon sequestration, all those things happening right there. This is the same project. This is in Delaware. There was a kind of again, a suite of techniques, multiple different techniques employed on this kind of long stretch. So this would kind of more constitute marsh edging on the bottom right there. And that's achieved by a log placed, looks like right at mean low water, close to low tide. And then a core log, which is coconut fibers, kind of all strung together. Those are kind of working in concert to establish that vegetation. And then to the left of that might be closer to a low profile sill. So we'll see, it looks like those rocks are kind of going underwater on those high tides because you can see some marine growth on them. So that's a low profile sill. And I think we've got, one more photo. This is on the eastern shore, kind of close to St. Michael's. Again, another low profile sill with some vents, which allow that water movement at high tide. One thing I just wanted to point out with this photo is we get some really great marsh creation on that right side, but we're still kind of severing that connection of land and water with this sill. So we still don't have a great interaction of land to water. This is kind of our only in and out for critters to go in and out of that created marsh. So a pretty small opening, but still great. So what happens is the energy goes up and we try and keep using these techniques, this sill technique. This is what it starts to look like. So as that energy goes up and we get more wind-driven waves coming in, we have to build that sill higher and higher and higher. And so you can see where that growth is. That's kind of our high tide line right there. So we're maybe 2 feet above high tide with this sill. So it's a really large structure. It's a large footprint. It looks to me a lot like a revetment, essentially, just out in the water with marsh creation behind it. And even when you try and put those gaps in there, it still isn't a great. It doesn't facilitate that great connection. So as that energy goes up and up, what some folks figured out is that if you actually break that segmented sill, that large high profile sill with larger gaps, you're able to kind of break that wave energy, and the wave is forced to bend. So this is a headland breakwater, and a lot of research was done with VIMS to make this work. And this is a ratio. This is kind of designed with a ratio that we find in nature, and kind of dictating where those gaps are and how big those headland structures are. As you can see, the photo in the top right, they had to move really, really far channelward to put this shoreline in. So again, this is you're gonna think about what type of resources you're impacting as you go channelward, that shallow water habitat. But it is neat to see this very open shoreline and that very good connection of land to water. So we can take it one step further. We can actually vegetate the headland itself, and by using not just armor stone riprap, we use different size of aggregates. We can actually, all the way from boulders all the way down to sand and everything in between, we can actually grow vegetation on the structure itself. And we're starting to see kind of this mosaic of different habitats where we have high marsh, low marsh, beach, kind of a calm inside the embayment, shallow water habitat, connected to the upland. So we're kind of seeing all those that mosaic of habitats all connected to each other. This is another photo of vegetated headland structures. This one was built in 2001. And, as those years go on, you can really, it's hard to see where the rock is. It really blends in quite well with the neighboring properties. This is another approach, which we're starting to see a little bit more of in Maryland. It's called a shingle beach, referred to as a shingle beach. I believe this is off the Chester River. But basically you're creating, this is a little bit more typical of something you might see up north where there's more available cobbles. But this is going to be mixed aggregates. So it'd be a sand beach, but you're going to mix in different size cobbles, pea gravel, 3/4 wash, different size aggregates. And the energy of the wave is dissipated as it rolls up that beach by moving those cobbles back and forth. And so because of that movement, it's harder to establish low marsh, but as you can see, the high marsh is doing really, really well, and it creates that open beach habitat. So this is a neat photo because you actually see a couple different types of techniques employed here. So on the bottom right of the photo, that's kind of the more traditional segmented sill with gaps and then marsh creation behind it. That one was put in years ago, I think, maybe coming up on 20 years ago. And it's looking good. The shoreline to the north of that, or actually, I guess in the photos to the south, but above that is a vegetated headland breakwater with 2 embayments, and then a shingle beach going down the left side with a terminal hook. And this was actually the first project that I built, first project that I worked on. And this is right after construction, so just all the structure, no plants. And what we really need is a photo. This was, I think, 4 years ago. We need a photo of from this angle after everything's grown in, because it looks quite a bit different now. Almost everything is fully vegetated. So it's cool to see those different approaches there. And then some other living shoreline technology or techniques. This is on the South River. I believe Rundle Rivers managed this project. But again, kind of traditional segmented sill. And then on either side, those are actually oyster reef balls. And there's a heavy monitoring component, I think, with this project because it's maybe not the first of its kind, but definitely some new technology for kind of mid-bay where they're trying to get oyster structures as shoreline erosion control. Some of those oyster reef balls were actually seeded with oysters, or they had spat on them. And others, I think, were put in just bare concrete. And the goal is to see kind of what happens and monitor what's growing on those structures and what kind of habitat they're providing. So I'm actually going to go see the site soon. So I'm excited to check it out. These are some photos from other states, because this is not happening in Maryland just yet. I believe this is Natrix is this builder, but they basically construct artificial reefs, much more common in kind of southern states where oysters do a lot better, saltier water, warmer water. And we're not seeing this in the Chesapeake Bay that much yet, maybe in Virginia, but not Maryland. And the idea is create that protection while also creating that oyster reef habitat. And again, I'm very envious of other states I mean, look at that oyster reef. That's amazing. So yeah, the one caution that we have in Maryland is on these low blowout tides. If you were to get a blowout tide like that in the wintertime, you would have a lot of die off with the oysters. So then the question becomes, okay, what other species are utilizing that structure for habitat? So that's kind of comes back to project goals. What are the goals of the project? If the goal is to grow oysters on that structure and they all die that winter and then don't come back the following year, then maybe the goal isn't achieved. But if it's just to create reef habitat for fish, not necessarily oysters, and if oysters come onto that reef, then great. But again, back to the goals. Now we're to the most fun part of living shorelines, which is permitting, and actually arguably the most challenging part of living shoreline projects. And that's kind of why I made this slide, is just to show the challenge, really everyone involved. But this is like my typical site visit. So this is one of my work days right here. This is the property owner pointing at his eroding cliff, and I'm just standing behind him, listening to his, sad tale. It's the worst you've ever seen. The waves are 10 feet tall. I'm like, oh wow, it sounds terrible. Okay. But we do see sites like this where houses are close to the edge. You might have trees falling in the water. This is a particularly tough shoreline to design a living shoreline. We have rapidly increasing depth off the shoreline. We have a very steep bank, no ability to grade back. And I'm no SAB expert, but I think that's eelgrass maybe right there. So we have a species that we want to, really think about impacting. So who's involved in this process? Critical Area Commission, MDE, local, county, and city grading permits. And then if we go 35 feet channelward or more than 500 linear feet, then the Army Corps is triggered to review. And then we might also have EPA, National Marine Fisheries weighing in on special aquatic resources. So I really just make this slide just to point out, this is an indication of how important this area is where we're working. You have all these different resources that are all touching essentially. So we're all kind of stepping on each other's toes in this zone. I think the most important thing, and that's what's so cool about this work group, is just that everyone's talking about it. Everyone's working together to figure out what is the best way to manage these resources. Where can we trade off on certain resources? Because ultimately, we need to figure out how to treat these shorelines the best way possible, whatever that looks like. And the caution I would just say is that we don't make it so hard that the easiest answer is just to put in that revetment. But these conversations are hugely important because we need to. It's such an important area, such a critical zone, and so thank you guys for talking about it. Just food for thought. Some of my questions, just as I think about SAV and shorelines, but how big of a role does coastal erosion play in SAV bed health? Is erosion good for SAVs? How much? How far back is a historical SAV bed a consideration? How long does that dormant potential seed bank stay there? If there's poor water quality because of too much erosion, how can we remedy that, et cetera? Is it better to impact a robust SAV bed or a fragmented SAV bed if you do have to impact an SAV bed? Is it possible to design for SAV habitat in a shoreline project, reducing that wave energy, opening up the embayments to create shallow water habitat, gradual slopes from structures as opposed to vertical edges that you might see on a sill? What is the perfect living shoreline for SAV habitat? If we're building a shoreline for SAV habitat, what does that look like? So just some questions to think about as we move through this meeting.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam.
Yeah, thank you.
There are a couple of questions in the chat for Sam.
Oh,
Yeah, so first I'll just read it. How is the headland breakwater different in terms of sediment transport from a series of groins along the coast? That's from Tay. Tay, if you want to come off mute and explain your question more, feel free. If not, take it away, Sam.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I can, let's see. So yeah, that's a really great question. Basically, there is a carrying capacity and there's a ratio when building these headland breakwaters where, and I can't fully explain the ratio, but someone understands it really well that could explain it. But basically, there's a carrying capacity of material inside of that embayment. So you could put the structure out in the water and or something that I'm really interested in is putting the structure up against a vertical bank. And basically what that would do is you're kind of planning for erosion. So in front of where you put the structure up against that bank, the embayment would erode to a certain stable condition. So there's a carrying capacity inside of those structures. Once that carrying capacity is reached, then any sediment that moves in there has the ability to move back out. So that's why the vegetated headland breakwater, the headland breakwater is a really neat approach, because it does, once it reaches that equilibrium, it does allow for sediment transport, not excessive erosion, but there's still that movement of sediment, which, as we talked about, is actually really important for a lot of processes.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sam.
I just
There are more questions. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tay.
Hi, this is Tay Evans from Mass DEP. And thanks for that explanation. I was thinking more, not the picture you're showing here with the offshore breakwaters with marsh growing behind it, but more the ones, I think you said it was at Assateague Island. You showed that kind of like this. Yeah, that looks to me similar to a groin. And we have a lot of these groins all along the beach, and they build up sand on one side and erode it on the other. So is this just designed because it's kind of sloped? It's designed not to do that?
Yeah. Short answer is yes. But it does that once it kind of reaches equilibrium. And actually, this is kind of a good photo, because these two bays, as we've been monitoring the shoreline, the bay kind of further away from us in the top of the photo, that bay was actually designed to be bigger. And so, meaning that the structures were put in, and there was concrete sand placed in that structure. And what actually happened was, because that bank further up in the photo is still eroding, that material was working its way around and filling up that bay. So that bay actually filled up more than what they thought it would. It accreted more material than they thought it would. That didn't happen in the next bay for whatever reason. So the short answer to that is yes, they're designed in such a way to catch material. But what I've been told is, once they reach that certain capacity, then that material kind of migrates around and continues to move. Whereas groins I think are similar, but there's a lot more movement in groins. So from a habitat perspective, you're not able to establish, if there's a lot of wave energy, you're not able to establish that low marsh and high marsh that you might be able to with these headland breakwaters.
Okay, thank you.
There are two more questions in the chat, but we're a little behind schedule. So hopefully we'll have some time, we can pick those questions back up. Or Sam, if you want to look at them in the chat. One's from Josh Moody about a living shoreline meeting project goals if it doesn't meet the ecological goals. And one from Jesse Murray about how the impacts might be from varied projects, about future impacts, future projects of the same area. So if you want to hit the chat on that. And if I can ask that you put those questions from your last slide in the chat, because that's going to be important to our later conversation. I think that'd be beneficial.
Sure.
We will kind of hopefully circle back. And then if you want to, I'm going to stop your sharing so that that's okay. And so next up we have Megan Fitzgerald. And if you're just joining us, and you can put your name and affiliation in the chat, we've missed you previously. So the next presentation, Megan Fitzgerald's been working on a literature review looking at all of the current information we have about SAV and living shorelines. I saw Megan on here. Oh, there you are. You should be able to share your screen.
Okay, let's see. Okay, can you
You put it in presentation mode, be able to see. There you go. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to present on this project I've been sort of focused on the last couple of months. Just a little bit of background on me. I work in the wetlands branch in the water division at EPA out of our Philadelphia office. So that EPA has 10 regions. The Region 3 office covers our Mid-Atlantic states, so Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and DC. Most of my time in this office has been focused on reviewing projects that require 404 permits, so Clean Water Act 404 permits. Anything that is proposing to dredge or fill a regulated resource like shallow water, like a wetland, streams, the ocean, or SAB. And a lot of that time I was focusing on reviewing projects in Maryland. I've recently shifted into a new position, but this project comes from my work in the regulatory space. And so with that, sort of the focus of EPA's role in the Clean Water Act, we really provide an oversight. We partner pretty heavily with the Army Corps of Engineers on the review of these projects. And from EPA's perspective, we would review projects trying to look at opportunities to minimize a proposed impact to a regulated resource. So a lot of those are wetlands and streams, but particularly in Maryland with, the goal of trying to soften our shorelines and to address the TMDLs to improve water quality in the Chesapeake Bay, we see a lot of living shorelines to do that. And, we started to get a little concerned about what we saw as an increasing number of living shorelines that were impacting SAB habitat, and really interested in looking for opportunities. As Sim alluded, can be a very fraught conversation, very, a lot of people having different opinions. Obviously, if you own that property and your house is going in, you don't want that to ever happen. And we're not really in favor of people losing their homes. But we're really looking for opportunities to, see if there's a design that we could look at, if there are opportunities to just sort of incorporate SAB, just looking, to have a conversation. So, in our role, we, provide comments to the Corps. And after a while, if you're feeling like maybe, not getting a lot of traction, what I was really interested in, it was just kind of zooming out and seeing what is everyone else doing. So that's the basis of this project, just to really do a literature review to see, Maryland is not the only one who's doing living shorelines. This is definitely not the first time that anyone has thought about doing living shorelines. So what I was interested in doing was searching the primary and secondary literature for other areas in the US, but also broadly, globally, just when you have this shallow water use conflict, and you really can't just say, just avoid the SAB or just ignore the SAB. How are people having that conversation? How are these projects being permitted? Is there something to bring back to Maryland or to the Chesapeake Bay area that could help address these conversations to help us move it forward so that we can, get to some sort of middle ground where we're seeing meaningful SAB protections, whether that's full avoidance or mitigation. And when we're also seeing, this work toward meeting the Chesapeake Bay goals. This slide is really kind of highlighting a little bit of what I just said. Just like to have it in words. We would see a lot of projects, trying to really highlight, the value of SAB, the value of shallow water. Often see that missing in proposals. So, one of my goals was to see how are other areas really highlighting the value, and does that matter in the permitting 404 process? Does that matter when you're having these conversations about what can be permitted, what cannot? I entered this, my background is in wetland restoration. I, to some extent, took this project on really trying to learn more about SAB. What am I missing? How can I have these conversations more, science behind me? And so as I'm going through these papers and studies and all these recommendations that are coming out from different agencies, I see this as a great opportunity to just highlight what is out there to our regulatory staff. The staff, there's just basically no time to lift your head up from your desk. It's just tons and tons of projects always coming in. And so at the end of the day, I'm really hoping that I will be able to highlight, what to the people that are making these decisions, that have to make these recommendations, to our core staff that have to, try to make sense of all these resource agencies and the public that are shouting to some extent, their perspective. How do we look at all of this and try to make a rational, informed decision? So that's one of my major end goals. With that, this slide is really to highlight, and I won't spend too much time on this, but really to highlight that my interest in this project and the perspective I'm coming from is this Clean Water Act 404 conversation. And so, really trying to highlight the main audience will be Corps and EPA staff. We have these conversations on a daily basis. We have, requirement opportunity through the 404 program to really discuss this in a couple different themes. So, how can we characterize better? Is there more information to characterize baseline information so that we can, get a sense of what has changed post-construction? Conversations about design, conversations about mitigation when it's appropriate, if it ever is, and performance standards. These are themes and conversations that EPA and Corps staff are very comfortable having. Well, we have them a lot. And so the recommendations that I'm hoping to sort of highlight are very much intended to follow these sort of themes. But in, our role at EPA is can look a little bit broader. So when I was designing, search terms and, trying to focus on, what do I want this project to, what questions do I want it to address? Outside of this specific conversation that EPA and Corps staff have about, the 404B1 guidelines and compliance with or without it, I am really interested in zooming out and seeing, at a larger scale, watershed level scale, what efforts should we be highlighting? Are we having the same conversation over and over again? Do we need to sort of shift? I don't think anyone's ever has at this point found the solution. But I think it's worth going back to the literature just to sort of revitalize and say, hey, this is where we have this information. And again, I'm coming from perspective of not really starting out, not understanding or knowing fully what is in the literature. This is very much a learning opportunity for myself, and hoping to just highlight a lot of, to some extent, especially in this space, I think a lot of what I am finding, I'm sure, is basic information. But I think for a lot of our regulators, there's just not a lot of time to go into the literature, and this may not be their background. And so I'm really hoping that I can highlight, this information that will improve their decision-making process. Okay, so these are my search terms that I've been using to really pull out. I didn't say at the beginning, my literature review is really focused on informing, the decision support process for the Army Corps staff. So it's not a literature review. It's focused on, the basic biology, really focused on, what are the management or implementation questions? How do we answer those? How do we improve our review of this information and put it through a lens of the 404 program? So these search terms are sort of using, that's the lens that these are going through. Okay, so the overall goal, again, is to support regulatory staff. What I've done since earlier this year is conduct a semi-systematic review of management recommendations, again, to support Corps and EPA staff review of these projects. And I am particularly interested, given the protected status of SAB, really interested in, where there's an opportunity to highlight additional protections for SAB, where living shorelines are being proposed. So does that always mean full avoidance? Probably not. But are there, as Sam suggested earlier, are there designs out there that people are trying and piloting that maybe have mixed results or great results or not great results? We should really be highlighting that in the regulated community so that we can sort of push back or ask additional questions. So it doesn't mean that I'm not at all trying to stop permitting of living shorelines that that I wouldn't be around for very long. Really just trying to highlight, what do we know right now? And I've identified a lot of resources. So about 2000, I am not sleeping, trying to get through the review of these. I will say the goal originally was for me to be done and have a draft decision support tool that I could start, having conversations with core and MDE staff about, making sure that the tool that, we might put out there, or we would put out there, is useful. I was hoping that would be sort of in a draft status by the end of this year, but that's not happening. I will be done reviewing, my resources and really starting to pull them into some sort of a tool form early next year. So definitely wanted to highlight what I'm doing in this space, to ask that if anyone has seen any, interesting studies, either about designs or large scale watershed, recommendations. Love to see those. I may have already pulled them in, but I doubt that I pulled in everything that's out there that can be useful. So really welcome any additional feedback on certain papers. If there's anybody I should be talking to, I didn't include this here, but my project was originally just, a literature review, get into these databases, identify your terms and start reading. And it evolved in a good way, but not what I expected. It evolved into sort of very much an interview heavy project. So I will be looking to sort of try to summarize all these conversations I've been having since spring that started before May. So if you're on this call and I've spoken to you, thank you very much. If you'd like to talk to me, reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you, just to get perspectives on what do we need to consider when we are trying to make this difficult have this difficult conversation about softening our shorelines. How do we value SAB the way we seem to be valuing marsh? And is there an opportunity to pull in the buffer habitat, the critical area? Is there a better way to have those conversations more holistically? As Sam, I really liked your design or your image there, highlighting all the just some of the agencies that have to have this conversation, and we all have different regulations and authorities. And it can be very easy to stay in our lane, but I think holistically, it makes a lot more sense if we can have these conversations a bit more collaboratively. So I hope someone already wrote a paper about that so I can highlight it in this project. I think, oh, crap. Sorry, I forgot about this. All right, so my outcomes and outputs. So the end result, I'm hoping to create a decision support tool. Again, the main audience would be the Army Corps and EPA staff. We have these conversations on a almost daily basis. And the Corps staff have this responsibility of issuing 404 permits. So, our EPA's job is to try to help them make that decision with all of the best information that we have. So this literature review is really intended to support their role in that. However, and if I haven't said this, absolutely, this tool will hopefully support other agency staff as well. So I've actively been in conversation with MDE staff and Maryland DNR staff, and would expect that I would continue to stay in conversation with them as I'm developing the draft tool to make sure it's as useful as it can be for everyone involved in this glorious process. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan, for coming aboard and giving us the sneak peek. If I can ask that you also put those questions in the chat, I think those are really good ones for us to revisit.
Yeah, sure.
It looks like is there a comment from Rachel? Rachel, did you want to come off mute for your comment?
Yeah, sure. So I am a researcher in North Carolina, and I've been studying living shorelines for I don't know, about a decade now. And so one of our biggest challenges with conducting research on impacts of living shorelines and other structures on SAV is that within our current permitting constraints, we're not allowed to experiment with how close we get to SAV, which is for good reason, obviously. But the scale at which you need to answer this question really is at the scale of a coastal protection structure. And so we have published a little bit of work on the impacts of living shorelines on seagrass, and our lab has also published work on meta-analyses on any kind of impacts of other types of structures on all sorts of ecological metrics. However, impacts on SAV you will find are lacking mainly because of this issue. We do a good job as kind of perimeters in not allowing these impacts to occur by not allowing structures to be constructed within close proximity to SAV. However, as projects get bigger and more complex, we are running into this issue in North Carolina. And so we just recently received a contract to actually study a really large scale living shoreline that's going in right now, both before and after sampling of seagrass along a really large stretch of shoreline with lots of seagrass and lots of different structures going in. It's a 3-year study. It's probably our best attempt to date to actually document whether there are effects, positive or negative, on shallow seagrass. And so just putting that idea out there that you may not find a lot of published literature on actual effects, particularly before and after effects of structure installation on SAV, although there are some kind of joint agency NGO research efforts to try to do this in the best way possible without actually letting things get installed that might actually harm the nearshore environment. So happy
Yeah.
to
Oh, thanks you. Yeah, I definitely found a couple of your papers, Rachel. So I
notice we
haven't
didn't
read
have.
them yet. They're somewhere
Well, they
in
won't tell you
SharePoint.
much. They won't tell you much.
Okay.
And that's the reality because all
Yeah.
of our sites didn't have
Mhm.
seagrass close to the
Right.
structures because
Yeah.
they wouldn't have been permitted that way anyway.
Yeah.
It's there's some modeling studies. I saw even Marie Cook had some papers. There's a great modeling paper. There's also Cindy Palinkas has put out a few papers. There's also some correlative papers out of Chesapeake Bay on riprap and SAV. But again, you're going to do a lot of this searching, and I think you're not going to find a lot of answers that are in the current literature because we have done a really good job, I think, of trying to protect SAV. And so I would say there's certainly a research gap there, and I really appreciate both federal and state agencies working with us in North Carolina for permitting us to kind of take a look at this in a way that I think can be rigorous. And I hope that other researchers in other states get the same opportunity because, this is just one state, one type of seagrass that we're going to be studying, namely Haladuli, a little bit of annual zostera, but if you know North Carolina, we don't get a lot of persistent shallow zostera that's going to come up close to the structures. So yeah, happy to chat more and happy to talk to anyone else, any other researchers or anyone who's taking advantage of opportunities to do before and after sampling, because it would be great to publish something that's more regional rather than just state specific.
Well, yeah, actually, you hit on something that I'm hoping to, be able to highlight in my sort of recommendations, the value of monitoring data pre and post, and really this long-term monitoring. Because I think a lot, particularly in Maryland, we're seeing living shoreline encroaching on SAV beds. And I think in a lot of other areas, you're not seeing that as much. So that just sort of discrepancy I'd like to highlight. But I also, I think with Cindy's paper, yeah, I think they found that adjacent beds were not negatively impacted, which is a good thing to know. But if you're putting a living shoreline on SAV, is it gone forever or does it come back? So I think that would be really useful in the 404 program when we're trying to make those decisions. So, if anyone on here, like if you routinely see SAV coming back with certain designs, which is what I think we hear anecdotally, that there are some designs that do allow in conditions where the and energy conditions are reduced, so SAV can, kind of get up behind the sill or something like that. But I think from a regulator's perspective, like on our side, we haven't seen that data. So that is what, I think a general ask will be at the end of my tool will be tool development, a recommendation of really trying to can we summarize that data? Is it out there? If it's still anecdotal, can we start a process of collecting it systematically so we can actually use it? If it doesn't exist, then maybe we should stop saying that. And maybe, so that's sort of a journey. But yeah, thanks, Rachel.
I'm not aware. I'm not aware of any projects in North Carolina where we were ever permitted to put structures on SAV. And so we've not been able in North Carolina to ask that question and actually collect any real data on it. I think I can speak for if anyone else from North Carolina is on this call and has a different opinion, please speak up. But to my knowledge, the work here, we're pretty cautious in the permitting. And so the data don't exist from North Carolina, I should say.
That's
Well,
good
and I
to
will
know.
say,
Yeah,
Rachel,
great.
you both are dovetailing nicely, and we have one more presentation from the regulatory
Yeah,
standpoint.
thank you.
Thank you, Megan. But then, Rachel, we have a section that we're trying to get these updates from other states for this exact purpose, so that there can be communication, coordination. And I think, Megan, it's definitely not surprising that so much of you have to go to interviews rather than published literature because of some of those factors that you're bringing in. So thank you, Megan. Yes, if you can put those questions that you had on your slide in the chat, and definitely, Rachel, appreciate that North Carolina update is certainly appreciated, and hopefully if there's other updates later on, we'll have a state section. So our last a small presentation about research needs. So the last component, well, not last, there are many components that we could include, was to focus really on the Army Corps. And so we've got, I think, Megan and Corey, right? But Megan, you'll kick us off first with some ideas from the Corps about where you see research needs. And again, if you have those questions that you've established, if you can paste them in the chat. So Megan, thank you for coming aboard and giving us.
Yeah, absolutely. Really happy to be here. Everybody can hear me okay and see my screen? Yep. Okay, cool. Yes. So let's see here. So yeah, thanks so much for having us here. I put together just a few slides with lots of help from Woody Francis, our aquaculture SME here in the Baltimore district, as well as Corey Rose, who's the ESA and EFH subject matter expert up at the TREC in North Atlantic Division. I do want to emphasize just before I get started that we're invited here to talk about living shoreline interactions with SAV. We certainly have a lot of the same questions for the nearshore estuarine environment in general and more broadly. Also just want to highlight that I also have a Chesapeake Bay bias. Most of the living shorelines that we see permitted in Maryland, they're going to be some sort of combination of what you see here, the sill and backfill living shorelines. So we have a suite of technologies available to us. And we authorize well over, I think, 100 SAV or 100 living shorelines in Maryland each year between the state's delegated authority under our general permit as well as our own. And the vast majority of them are still least sill and breakwater living shorelines. These pictures are some immature ones that I'm not fully grown in yet. But you can see the variation of the sill height. You can see variation in design, even with just that design. Not to mention all of the other techniques we have, like the acetate island vegetated breakwater system that Sam highlighted. So before I get into research needs, just want to spend a minute giving sort of a regulatory context, and Megan did a good job of providing some of this. Sam did as well. Highlight some of the knowledge gaps that we need to kind of fully fulfill our obligation under all the various authorities that we have. I do want to take some time to talk about what we are actually doing now to address some of these knowledge gaps within the Corps, and then what's still needed. So if you're not a regulator, if you haven't been involved in this world, the regulatory process, especially on the Corps side, is very complex. A federal permit is a federal action, and so any decision that we make has to comply with a suite of federal laws and regulations and guidelines. So I've thrown a few up here that really take into account SAV impacts. The three that are most important are the Magnuson-Stevens Act, Endangered Species Act, and Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act is probably the most, provides the most protection for SAV, as it is a special aquatic site under the 404B1 guidelines. And so what that means is, kind of in a very oversimplified way, this is, my 30-second core program here. These are sort of the concepts that are really important to us and are important for people to understand when we're talking about how do you get a core permit for a living shoreline that impacts SAV. First is the understanding that the Corps is not a project proponent. We are not a project opponent. We do not enter into this space with sort of this inherent, acceptance that a living shoreline is always going to be the best option for a living shoreline. That's not our job. Our job is to look at each project and to look at avoidance, minimization, and mitigation. The way that we do that is describing and quantifying all impacts that we can, that's reasonable to describe and quantify within our scope of analysis. That includes temporary, permanent, direct, indirect, individual, and cumulative impacts. To look at a suite of alternatives that are available to address a purpose and need of the project, and to select the least environmentally damaging practical alternative that is available to accomplish that an applicant's purpose and need. And so that's kind of a key difference between something like NEPA, where we are required to describe all environmental impacts, but not necessarily to select the least environmentally damaging alternative, and the Clean Water Act, Section 404B1, which really does require that we are only selecting the least environmentally damaging practical alternative. And this all kind of gets wrapped up in this general idea of no net loss of wetlands, no net loss of aquatic ecosystem function. It's basically, in a nutshell, our job to kind of try to ensure this no net loss while allowing for reasonable development. So that sets up our knowledge gaps. We hear a lot like, oh, it's so much easier to get a permit for a revetment. You're kind of implicitly encouraging revetments and shoreline hardening because it's so much easier to get these permits. But on the other hand, with larger scale impacts, with larger scale acreages of impacts comes, and with more complex projects comes with more of a responsibility to really make sure that we understand all the intricacies of that project. So some of our knowledge gaps are really basic. Just what are the full scope of impacts, right? How can we really efficiently describe not only individual adverse and direct impacts, which tend to be pretty easy to describe no matter what project you're looking at, but how can we describe those efficiently within our 60 to 100-day published review times? And how can we really assess aquatic resource functional losses and gains to determine this net effect? There's kind of this pervasive idea that living shorelines are self-mitigating. If you put a living shoreline in, it's going to have a net benefit to the aquatic ecosystem. And we're really trying to get at, in a very unbiased and clear-eyed way, how can we efficiently describe that in our permit process, and how can we ensure that that's actually happening? That gets into kind of this avoidance and minimization and identifying the lead puff. We've talked about how can living shorelines be designed to minimize impacts to SAV or to actually incorporate SAV. And as a regulator, our job is to look at a project, not to design the project. We're not trying to do that, but we're trying to assess what alternative actions might be able to be taken that have some sort of describable impact on SAV in the nearshore habitat. And this gets very project specific. So sill height, slope, grain size of the sediment you're using, the marsh width, and just general design approach. All of those things we have to look at on a project by project basis and make decisions about. And so it's complicated. And then mitigation, we very rarely require mitigation for living shoreline projects. We very rarely have required mitigation for living shoreline projects, even when they do impact SAV. And in Maryland, it is fairly common, I think now. Pretty much, I think most living shorelines that the Corps permits at this point, many of them are going to have, maybe not most, but many of them have SAV impacts. A lot of the ones that don't are able to be smaller and are able to be permitted under the authority delegated to the state of Maryland. But that is one trigger that automatically sends it over to the Corps as having SAV impacts. So one of the reasons I think we don't require SAV mitigation is this idea, or for living shoreline projects, is this idea that living shorelines should be, when they're constructed well, they should have a net aquatic ecosystem uplift, right? But the other reason are sort of these scientific and administrative gaps to effective SAV mitigation, which I really think kind of inhibits us to sort of to require it basically in a way that we know is going to compensate for the impacts. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about our sort of newly formed Maryland Shoreline Project Review Team. So from an administrative side, this is one of the things that we're doing to try to get, evaluate project by project what these impacts are. I'm not going to talk about it now. I just wanted to throw it out that it's there. And if you have questions about it, you can feel free to contact me. But what I do want to talk about is what we are doing. So we are lucky to have the Engineering Research and Design Center down in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and they have established a program. So that's our Army Corps' research branch, essentially. There's a program within that called the Wetlands Regulatory Assistance Program, where every district can submit research questions, can pose research questions to ERDIC, and headquarters can decide if those projects can be taken up and funded and studied. So two of them that I want to talk about. The first is the nationwide SAV functional assessment and mitigation calculator led by Safra Altman, who's on the call today. The purpose of this project is to develop national but regionalized science-based index models and calculators to assess both the functional capacity of estuarine SAV beds and then to, develop a mitigation calculator for those impacts. The products of this should be functional models, both conceptual and numeric, a spreadsheet calculator, and user instructions. So we are starting this work over on, I mentioned there, it's going to be regionalized. So we are starting this work over on the West Coast for FY 2025, and we've been collaborating with the Nearshore Save project led by Pew Charitable Trust and NOAA out there. So we're hoping to kind of capitalize on the work that's being done out on the West Coast, and then hopefully in future iterations be able to use that over on this side to develop regionalized models. What we need from this group, if you have it, is your data. If you have data that establish relationships between physical characteristics of SAV beds and their functional outputs, we would love to see that, whether it's published, whether it's in white papers, whether it's just data that you have collected or have been collecting over time. I think we could also use examples of successful mitigation strategies for eventual development of these mitigation calculators, and any examples of SAV functional assessments that you have already. How can we evaluate the relative function of different SAV beds? The second one, which ties really well into some of what Rachel and Megan were talking about, is the evaluation of ecological trade-offs for living shoreline projects. So for FY24, this is going to be a white paper and literature review. And I'm sorry, this is led by Dr. Emily Russ, who's also on the line. So this will be to identify direct and indirect impacts, both beneficial and adverse, of living shoreline construction, with the goal of kind of providing a way to assess these ecological trade-offs of living shorelines that impact SAV. So for fiscal year 25, which just started, the proposed scope of work is to actually do a field assessment to analyze these direct and indirect adverse and beneficial impacts at different sites in the Chesapeake Bay region. So again, if you have data to this effect, please let us know. And also just for general awareness for FY25, rapidly funding a cooperative agreement through the Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So to be continued there. Other needs, I think just generally letting us know what you're working on would be extremely helpful. And we talked about the knowledge gaps. Anything that you have or can work towards addressing some of those knowledge gaps would be really helpful. Specifically, it's this question of how can a regulator, put yourself in the mind of a regulator who's looking at something on a plan sheet and looking at the landscape context and wondering, is this going to affect SAV? And what can we do? How can we help the regulated public in minimizing those impacts to SAV and minimizing those impacts to the nearshore environment? So I'm going to stop there. I know we're constrained on time, but I have my all of our contact information up here. If you want to talk more, I could talk about this all day. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Megan, and for your whole team, really bringing everyone here to give us an idea of where you're at with it. So well, I have most of the questions. I've been trying to copy and paste the questions that our presenters have had onto one slide so that we can kind of have that in front of us as well. So at this point, we want to kind of transition to get those state updates. So some of those data sources, Megan, that you're looking for, actually both Megans, right? So where are the projects happening, particularly considering a lot of them are in flux or have the idea of starting, but not necessarily going anywhere quite yet. And so I put both Z, myself, and Brooke on the schedule to give a little update about where things stand. And from my perspective, I just have a few slides, and actually it's heartening, I guess, to know it's kind of redundant with some of the things that we've already seen, mainly just for where we're at with kind of in New Jersey, but also the proxies that we're trying to use to get at some of these questions. And so I'm just going to flip through these kind of quickly, but to give you an idea of some of the efforts here in New Jersey that I've been involved in. And a lot of this Living Shorelines work, and in this presentation, I gave a much scaled down version at Ray a couple weeks ago, because the focus for the panel I put together for Ray was about what other habitats are really being involved here, and that it's really a holistic approach when we're considering some of these living shoreline designs, because it's not just the SAV, there's other components, as much as I would like for it to be all about the SAV. And a lot of these come into these two main factors, either creating a new habitat or tracking the impact of a disturbance, because there's a lack of data on the current system to get at, what is actually happening in my case in New Jersey, and how are these living shorelines potentially going to impact SAV because of some of those restrictions, which is protective of the SAV, but then how else can I get at some of those answers? And so these were some of the qualities that I was considering, and I'm either designing the SAV component of a living shorelines or what to monitor for it. And so the first four components really have more to do without creating a new habitat. And some of that information can come from the restoration literature. And I know this working group or this collaborative, we've had different sessions on restoration as well. And then, as I said, in March, we'll do mitigation. But looking at what factors come into creating a new habitat. And we're all from the SAV side familiar with, we need to know depth, modeling. What does the depth look like if I'm choosing a site for restoration? Sometimes I have to use proxies for light because I don't necessarily have a light meter in the benthos. And so I'm using other metrics like TSS or chlorophyll A. Temperature is really going to be important for the SAV species. Soil is something that I've incorporated into all the projects and I've spoke of previously, looking at the sand silt clay, so the grain size and the growing horizon. And that can also give me a proxy for currents, because that's my seed delivery to a site. And then when I don't have any current measurements, using wind speed. So that's just if I'm trying to choose a site. But these living shorelines projects aren't really happening where I necessarily would design them to happen. They're happening from a human-based need. And getting at some of the answers to what's the impact of that disturbance on SAV, and considering what's the footprint of the project and the method. And in New Jersey, there's been a lot of the shellfish SAV interactions, whether it come from a deliberate aquaculture standpoint or from incorporating them into the living shorelines dynamic. And so I think Corey put in the chat about the gap of what's the impact of those structures. So I was taking advantage of some of the what I call projects of opportunity. And this is just a figure that is from the literature looking at like aquaculture, like a rack and bag system, because once you're starting to add in the animal components, it's not only the hydrodynamics that are going to be changed, which is the goal of living shorelines, right? To avoid erosion. So I liked, Sam, your point about not all erosion is bad. It is somewhat natural. And if you're on an uninhabited island, you can kind of play around a bit more. And in this case, I was looking more at the impact of this gear. And the literature we already have is showing us some of these answers. This is an article about a journal that Masick did, where it was the hydrodynamics and having these structures on eelgrass seed trapping. And so that was one of the projects that I was doing, was working with the aquaculture partners. They have a structure in the water. And I was just loosely saying, okay, if I've got a structure, how is that going to impact where the seed will be retained for eelgrass, and what is the water quality doing? And the hydrodynamics were important. And so luckily when you're at a higher ed institution, you've got partners built in-house. And so that can decrease the costs. I can put out sediment traps. And so here there's two different ones, working with a coastal oceanography, a class and a professor, looking at how much the soil is being deposited and resuspended within the gear fields, and then repeating this kind of information within the living shorelines dynamic, so where those structures might be, and then also looking at current profiles, so where I didn't have that information, doing tilt current meters and ADCPs, to see actually what's happening within this area of disturbance, just generally calling it an area of disturbance. But when it's a project of opportunity, you also then add some things that aren't in the experimental plan for SAV. And in this case, this project had a lot of birds. So if you deal with aquaculture, if you put a structure out, birds will want to settle, and birds have guano. So gaining some of that information, though, was important to look at and formulate the approach to doing the baseline monitoring before, and then once there was some type of structure installed. When they're projects of opportunity, one of the things that came out of the Ray presentation is that we kind of asked the audience, how many of these living shorelines are really designed to create habitat for SAV? And the answer is none. No one raised their hand, because most of the time the goal really is about erosion first and foremost, because the objective of each project might differ in its minutia, but erosion typically is the problem that's brought to the forefront. And so besides birds being an issue, what other communities might be present that cause an issue, and how the shellfish can play a role in that. And so these other last two examples are more closer to living shoreline-esque. So if you can create some type of habitat adjacent to a marsh, and I call it kind of co-creating a habitat where there's no people around. So that's the luxury, is that it doesn't have to necessarily be something that the metric is stopping erosion, but more about what can you actually create adjacent to a sedge island in this case, to see if that actually could be something. Do you see a change in the erosional rates? And so while we were able to actually create this habitat, we did end up having a problem with oyster drills. So that just goes to the idea of some of your oyster co-creating. You have to find the right habitat that will work for both species. If you're wanting to grow, an oyster reef on a berm or a sill or a reef, or we were using berms perpendicular to shore because of the current flow. But you have to have both habitats in the perfect proportions and the perfect conditions, really, for that to actually work. Which, again, living shorelines it's not always projects of opportunity here. And in this case, so the last example I just want to briefly mention and report on is the one that really was more designed. So co-created this, and there's people, obviously. So this is a shoreline where there's houses. They're directly experiencing the erosion. This project wasn't designed to create seagrass habitat, but this is a line from the actual proposal, that the idea is to build these reefs offshore, a structure to stop the erosion. And the thought was, can this actually improve the water clarity, with their theory being that it would increase the conditions for SAV growth and establishment. So again, the goal isn't to create SAV, but if there could be a potential benefit, and it gets to some of the questions that you guys were providing, is there a method that might be less destructive? And so because I was brought on to kind of do the before and after, so kind of a Baki experiment here, I kind of used the lessons learned from the other projects that I've been doing in the Bay to increase the number of replicates throughout the study site, increase the spatial coverage of the actual transects that I was doing. And because the soil I was finding was telling such an important story, that I added in these soil collections for it. And one of the first things that was really evident is that to permit some of these sites, the survey guidelines for permitting is drastically different than the SAV response metrics, as it should be, right? So if there's a small scale project, I want way more replicates so that I know that I've got the statistical power to analyze that later, to get to those not anecdotal, but get to the meaty results that can be used to inform future decisions. But the problem is it costs more. You have to bring someone in that's going to be able to set up the study in advance, and then have the funding, and this is so key, the funding to continue to monitor for 5 years probably afterwards. And that's what's really lacking. I've seen a really big gap when it comes to what's the result of these projects. And so kind of using that information at this particular site was looking at, okay, how is that actually going to impact? And the orange squiggles you can see there, that's looking using cages with rock and then some spat on oyster, spat on whelk around the outside to kind of give a breakwater, but then hopefully like this living ecosystem. And in this case, the baseline survey showed that on the northern tip of this site, there's a pretty lush seagrass bed. So that northernmost section of the reef was removed from the permit so that it destroyed the least amount of seagrass, but there was seagrass throughout the site in much sparser numbers. So I actually have solid data prior to the installation of those cages, and I've now been following it. This will be 2025 will be the 4th year. And I just head note there. So it started at 5.7 acres at my baseline survey, and there's been a 75% decline in the seagrass in the area. And that is considering, we have declines throughout Barnegat Bay, but this site has been a pretty dramatic decrease in the footprint there. So I think this idea, this co-creation as the projects are coming forward, it really helped that I was taking into consideration some of those lessons learned from the other sites and into giving that plan. And so the other headline is the soil grain size. And so what I did is took quite a few dozens of samples throughout the Barnegat Bay area, but then also compared it to other regions. We have a really nice subaqueous soil map that I was lucky enough to coordinate with USDA on. And so look at what point is there a tipping between it supporting SAV or not based on the sand, silt, and clay content. And so this is just, I think that's a 22 figure I grabbed. So how is that changing once that structure's in the water and following that along? And they're doing what they're supposed to do, right? Because this was not designed to create SAV. So they're slowing the currents, which means that the finer grained, you're getting some settlement of the finer grain material, which is not necessarily conducive to the seagrass growth. And so that's an important trend that I'm going to continue to follow, despite it declining. So at both sites, really at all 3 sites that I mentioned, I've seen declines in seagrass. Most notably, the change in the grain size has been one of the important components to consider that I'm at least incorporating into future studies. So that's what I kind of wanted to mention from the New Jersey side, is kind of using some of my existing studies as proxies, because we don't necessarily have the exact studies that before and after control, incorporating, a design plan that's not just about the permitting survey, which was just to determine whether or not something was there, but if the research question needs to be to fill in the gaps for the Corps or for the EPA or for your local state agencies, then there needs to be a little bit more design going into the seagrass surveys beyond that permitting component. And so one last thing before I pass it to Brooke is that in the chat, I'm going to put a link to a survey. So this survey worked with Aaron Riley at VIMS to develop, as well as my co-presenters, Amy Bredes, Ali Fitzgerald, and Meredith Comey at Ray. And the idea is that some of the things that we're finding is that there's a not really eagerness to talk about negative outcomes or failures when it comes to these types of projects, because it does impact potentially future funding or the public perception of wanting to do a living shoreline. In New Jersey, it's an option versus other states where it's not an option. And so this survey was us. We've had some good responses, and I'm eager to get some more. So if you yourself deal with living shorelines work, permitting, funding, implementation, please consider doing that. And it's about kind of the narrative around how we discuss living shorelines, share results, share project, we're calling them negative outcomes, because failures tends to be a tricky word for some people. So that's it. And I'll pass it over to Brooke for her update on the Maryland side of the story.
Thanks, Z. So I didn't really put together any slides. I've got a couple that I could pull up, but I think I'm going to skip them. Mainly, so as we have seen, living shorelines are so complicated. I do want to go back real quick to the regulatory side of things. While we were hoping to get somebody from North Carolina to join us for the session that Megan Spindler discussed regulatory needs, requirements, and whatnot. And he couldn't join us today, but Jacob Boyd with the North Carolina Coastal Federation did ask that I purvey the information that their biggest need is habitat trade-off valuation. So when there are SAV impacts, how do we evaluate those trade-offs? And we've been talking about this, but that's an established need down there too. He was curious how other states are handling it when there are impacts, and whether you mitigate in kind, out of kind, pay into a fund, et cetera. Essentially, just what's allowable, what's deemed doable and acceptable. He also wanted me to share that they are funded to do a living shoreline and SAV interaction study that they're beginning soon. So that I'm not sure, that might be the same one that Rachel was talking about.
Yes,
Right?
it's the same one. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So we will have more information soon on that from them. Well, a couple years, I guess. Okay, so I just wanted to share that from Jacob's perspective. So in Maryland, as you saw from Sam, we have all sorts of things going on with living shorelines, lots of big questions, lots of work. Until Megan pointed out, I didn't really realize the number of living shorelines that are going in every year. That's substantial. So, we are constantly grappling with impacts to SAV in Maryland. We do, I kind of, North Carolina, Rachel said that they just pretty much avoid SAV impacts. We avoid, we minimize, we mitigate, but there, like Megan said, there are SAV impacts. So we are, constantly in conversation about how to deal with those impacts when when they're inevitable. And one thing that I wanted to share is that in January, it hasn't been scheduled yet, but we are planning to run a workshop on SAV mitigation and monitoring requirements. So when a project does impact SAV, and it doesn't, not necessarily living shoreline, any sort of project that impacts SAV, we will be discussing, it'll be a day-long workshop, we'll be discussing what the mitigation requirements are, and then how we gauge success for the mitigation project and how we monitor the mitigation project. So, and then if it's a failure or it has a negative outcome, how we then go on to remedy that in the long run. So if you are interested in participating in that workshop, we would love, non-Maryland voices to be involved. It actually is a Bay-wide, so we'll have Virginia as well, but we welcome folks from outside of the region. I think Z is planning to attend. So put it in the chat or email me, whatever, if you want to participate. We don't have the date yet, but I'm working on that. It's looking like January 30th. But I will keep you posted. Aside from that, so one of the things with SAV mitigation is that we obviously have limited capacity for direct mitigation. So to plant SAV, and my dog has decided to bark. Hope you can't hear that. But we have limited capacity to do actual SAV restoration. We don't have SAV nurseries. We don't have, we only have a few SAV processing centers. So when we're talking about requiring SAV mitigation for SAV impacts, that's a big deal because we have to figure out the logistics of how we're going to collect the seeds, how we're going to process the seeds, and how we're going to do the planting. That's one of the big things that we're working on is expanding capacity for SAV restoration right now. So hopefully we'll figure out this bottleneck in the near future. But for now, that is something to take into consideration. Another thing that I wanted to share is that I actually do have a project looking at SAV and living shoreline interactions. It's titled the SAV Living Shoreline Compatibility Study. It is a very, very limited study. I got a tiny little bit of funding from within DNR to do this project, and it was based on the need to figure out what to do about SAV impacts, how we can mitigate them, and then if we can incorporate SAV restoration into the initial project design. So while we are, designing living shorelines actually designed to plant SAV. The project has been a little squirrely. We picked 3 sites, 3 living shoreline sites. The idea was to do a BACI study, so before, after, control, impact. We picked 3 sites that had not been constructed yet, and it's a 3-year study, so we didn't have very much time, but we were going to do a before survey. The construction was going to happen over the winter. We were going to do an after survey, and the following summer we were going to do, or this following spring, our plan is to do plantings at each of the living shorelines. Unfortunately, one of them was not constructed, so that kicked us down to 2 sites. And then the second shoreline was only partially constructed because they ran out of dredge material, and it's just not complete yet. They're waiting for dredge material availability. So the project is almost over, and I have next spring to finish it up. But we did have one project that got built, and it is one of those headland breakwater designs where you've got the coves. And we will be doing plantings in the spring inside one of the groins, I think, or one of the embayments is what it's called. So I don't have any results yet. I'm hoping that it'll work, but there will be a case study. It's going to be, obviously with just one site, we can't extrapolate too much, but it will be a solid case study to look at for SAV impacts, and then incorporating SAV restoration into the actual project. So I'll report back in a year or so. But that is, let me see if I wrote anything else down. Yeah, that's mostly it with what we're doing in Maryland. I will mention, and I think somebody else mentioned it on here, we did do a study years ago looking at shoreline alteration in general on SAV. It was part of a broader NOAA study that funded, I think there were like 17 institutions involved. We were looking at lots of resources and how shoreline alteration, bulkheads, riprap, et cetera, affected shorebirds, fish communities, SAV, marsh communities, et cetera. There's a whole special issue in estuaries and coasts on it. And I was involved in the SAV component. And we did find that, bulkheads, obviously, and riprap do have a significantly negative impact on SAV. So one of the things that also drove the study that I'm working on, if we want to still call it a study, is that I don't want to see riprap just automatically defaulted to when there are SAV impacts for living shorelines. The goal is to figure out how to make a living shoreline work regardless of SAV presence, because we know that riprap and bulkhead can be bad, and those things get permitted when there are too many impacts to the SAV. So yeah, I think that's it for Maryland. I'll leave it
Great.
at that. We can open it up to the other states.
Thanks, Brooke. Yeah, so if you have an update for your state, or any projects that you're aware of, or Rachel, if you want to add anything to your project, I feel like you've encapsulated it pretty well, what your pending project.
Yeah, I'll just mention that, yeah, this project, we have completed our before data collection. So the structures that are going in North Carolina are being placed in this winter. So they've started construction a few weeks ago, and we're doing a combination of in situ field transect-based surveys, but also drone surveys. We're doing in situ percent cover. We're taking cores. We're collecting a lot of data. And so we do hope to have, before data, initial, immediate post-construction surveys. And then, we hope to continue to monitor. We have funding for 2 years post, or expected funding for 2 years post. But as many of our projects, we try to cobble together continued monitoring at sites where we start working. And so we've been fairly successful in our lab of being able to revisit sites at 5-year marks and 10-year marks for other kind of ecological questions. And so I'm hoping this will be a start of a similar type assessment for SAV. There is a plan to do some experimental planting of seagrass adjacent to some of these structures as part of a student's PhD project, just to kind of see if there's some, experimental ways we can look at direct impacts on SAV that's been transplanted close to these structures. Anyone who's done any kind of seagrass experimentation and transplantation or restoration knows it's very challenging. It may all die anyway, right? So we'll see, but that's one experimental approach that's going to be incorporated into this work, aside from just the monitoring. And we do have a paper that we hope to submit in the spring that has some sites that have been monitored, newly constructed, new substrate, living shorelines, new designs, but those are all after installation, immediately post-installation comparisons to reference shorelines, again with, SAV that is near but not really, really close to the structures. So based on my preliminary look at the data, I don't expect that we're going to see any effects one way or the other. I just think the SAV is too far away from the structures. So we will publish that, but it's not going to be the definitive evidence one way or another, because it's SAV that's not, being built, right on top of or really close to in terms of where the structures are going.
Nice. So we have a lot of hands up. I think the first one up was Ann Deaton.
Hey, Brooke.
Hi.
This is Ann. Look at the cool background I found on Zoom. I didn't know that existed till today. I was just going to say that recently we've had several new permit applications come through that they wanted to put a living shoreline on or very close to the SAV. And the one, they're both in the northern part of our state, and the one we got them to modify it so that the rock sills were not on the grass itself. But I think one of the other big research questions is how close is how far away is far enough away, because we know it changes the wave energy in the sediment. And how big of a gap. Sometimes, we're looking at bigger gaps between sills to allow more ingress of the fish, more flow. And, when you're trying to protect the wetlands, we usually get a pushback on that because they want it protected, but we're trying to balance it with everything. And so would increased gaps help the grass? I don't know. There's another, and the other permit is it's very interesting. It's behind Duck in Currituck County, and they've had a tremendous erosion of their wetlands. But everywhere where the erosion occurred, the grass that was further off has just filled it. It's full of seagrass. They want to put construction mats on the grass so that they could put in a vertical sill at the edge of where the wetlands is now. So, we got them to change that, but I still, I don't even know if they have their permit yet. It would be a good one to monitor. It might not be too late to do that before. It might be too late on that riprap one, but there are opportunities. If anybody has time in North Carolina, I could put in a little time, but probably not enough to do it justice. Anyway, we definitely need that. And the trade-off thing, like Jacob mentioned, is, again, it's important and is hard to calculate because wetlands versus seagrass, and we know the seagrass is really struggling, but we know the wetlands is having trouble in places. So, what do you do? Anyhow, that's all I was going to add. I put something in the chat about there's another project putting a big sill around Spoil Island. And part of the design was to do planting of seagrass inside. And I told them I wouldn't, at least not initially, because let us see how it changes with sediment. But I didn't know if anybody had any more information on seagrass coming in behind these structures. But like Z mentioned, I think the sediment, it changes. So I don't think it's very compatible unless somebody knows of some good examples.
I do know that there was a study that Eva Maria Koch did years ago, long time now, that a living shoreline was put in and the sediment characteristics changed behind the sill, and SAV came in initially and did very well. And then the sedimentation continued and eventually buried the SAV.
Yeah.
But I've been to that living shoreline recently and there's SAV there again now. So, yeah,
On the inside or the outside?
on the inside.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a fairly large space. It was pretty far out. It created kind of it was at a camp. They were looking to create a swimming area as well. So it's full of SAV now.
All right. Good to know.
Also quite muddy, but yes.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. We also have hands up from Judd Kenworthy. Judd, you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Brooke.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention, I put this in the chat, but Elizabeth's discussion about looking closely at the sediments reminded me of this. And there's been several modeling studies that have been published in the last few years that suggest there's a strong interaction between the marsh edge and the seagrass beds. And this is related to sediment dynamics. And it's sort of a give and take between the marsh and the seagrass beds. So I'm wondering if there are any folks thinking about this in terms of how they design their research with respect, because it appears to me that it's quite possible if a living shoreline is designed to prevent erosion, it's actually going to have an effect on the seagrass beds in this interaction. So something just to think about. And if anyone wants wants the references to those studies, let me know and I can send them the papers. Thanks.
Thanks, Judd. Appreciate it. Becky Swarita, you also have your hand up. Go for it.
Hello. I joined late, but I was able to join, which is good. And excuse my voice, I've been talking constantly for a week and a half. So I've mentioned it probably to many people here before, but I have a series of living shorelines, total of 8 of them that I have been doing Backy design monitoring on at a very low capacity level. Because it's basically just me. And the purpose of that monitoring has been primarily looking at the wetland dynamics and are those shorelines achieving those erosion goals, erosion control goals. However, I have been able to put just a couple little plots out into the nearshore area and have observed some limited SAV both before and after on a couple of those. I am moving into the sort of analysis phase of those projects, as all but one of them have been recently constructed. And I would absolutely love it if anyone would like to talk about how to best sort of squeeze as much information out of this limited amount of data as possible, because I'm not sure the best way to approach it. But that monitoring has included elevation, sediment, and honestly kind of a rough there's more than 50% SAV or less than 50% SAV and species, but it does exist. I also, one of those 8 projects is an upcoming thin layer placement project, which is scheduled to potentially start construction tomorrow. And I have, again, that sort of same limited amount of pre-construction data, but there's been some new desire for an increased look at the SAV component because there is a lot of SAV at this site. And I am planning, with Brooke's help, hopefully, to do a little bit more in-depth look at SAV at a thin layer placement restoration type component. So if anyone also is interested in that or has advice for me, I'm all ears. But I would really love to see what this group may think about how I can use the limited amount of SAV data with living shorelines that I have. So please reach out if you're interested. Thanks.
Thanks, Becky. Does anybody have advice for Becky? If not, and we can continue the discussion, but what about other states? What's going on? We've heard a lot from Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina. What is going on with living shorelines and SAV further north? There are folks on the call further north. Are you all having living shoreline issues? Anybody want to pipe up?
Hello, I'll say something on behalf of New Jersey Fish and Wildlife, New Jersey DEP. So I would say at this stage, like when it comes to living shoreline projects, we really are just not seeing many results. So if monitoring's happening from the state standpoint, we never end up seeing some of the results. So some of the big push for us has been if there are living shoreline projects within or near SAV meadows to put emphasis on sharing one, having monitoring happening pre and post construction, and also to send those results to us so we can see that.
Yeah, I think there's hopefully a whole lot of unpublished data out there just waiting to be published. Maybe this will be the push. Anybody else from the northern states? Anybody up in Massachusetts or New York?
I can chime in from even further north up in Maine.
Excellent.
We are in the infancy of living shorelines up here. I was brainstorming with Angie Brewer on this call, and we could think of 3 in the entire state. All of those have not been hugely successful for reasons more relating to the construction of the shoreline themselves than anything with SAV. And all 3 projects are also in areas that don't have SAV and have experienced recent SAV loss for other reasons. So we have very little to contribute to this conversation because we just haven't gotten to a point yet where we can even think about the potential interactions of SAV and living shorelines.
Great, thank you. I really like your shirt too. Like sea friends with a big old shark on it.
Thank you.
Like
it looks like Angie might want to chime in something about what's happening
Yep.
here in Maine as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks.
I agree that Maine is very much in its infancy in terms of living shorelines work, but we had some pretty major winter storms early this year, and the Maine DEP received a lot of emergency requests for shoreline stabilization, which are all very hard solutions. And so there's currently a policy update occurring to provide more flexibility for soft shoreline armoring and stabilization. So I can't share the details of that just yet. But that's also going to be addressing where riprap can be allowed based on proximity of upland structures to the eroding shoreline. So that should be really, really interesting coming forward. And then also the Maine Conservation Corps, which manages our AmeriCorps internship programs in Maine, has developed a shore corps, which is basically it's 2 or 3 positions. I think it's a 52-week position. And these individuals, when hired, are going to be supporting coastal landowners and developing guidance documents for shoreline stabilization techniques. So lots coming out that's promising, but nothing really being implemented on a larger scale just yet.
Yeah, thank you. That's really cool. I like shore corps. Good. Well, let us know when those documents are out. That'd be great. Thanks. Jamie, I think your hand was up next.
Jamie, you're muted. All right, there we go. Reporting in from Connecticut. I have a colleague at the Connecticut NER who works with the Reef Ball Foundation. So we've been looking at the reef ball installations in Connecticut from a research and monitoring standpoint. Both a set of reef balls installed in Stratford, Connecticut, which has been in for, I want to say some of them have been in for over 10 years. possibly approaching 15 now, and then a more recent installation at Connecticut College in Eastern Connecticut. And we've been looking at carbon sequestration rates at these sites by analyzing sediment accretion rate and carbon content. And then we've also been looking at vertebrate use of the reef balls and the neighboring marsh. And so by deploying GoPros and then analyzing those for community composition and figuring out the best method to do that in these environments. The other project I wanted to mention is we have some upcoming work with one of our state parks, looking at converting a parking lot that floods frequently, perhaps daily, back into marsh, and potentially looking at other living shoreline type of installations in that area. And we'll be starting our public hearings, or I shouldn't say hearings because that's a legal term, our public meetings to get input from the local community, I want to say next week. So we're moving along on that project. We're in the design phase, and then we hope to be asking for a much larger sum of money to work on that parking lot, and also to kind of reorder some culverts and turn some hardened areas into a more natural shoreline. So that's our update from the reserve.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. All right, we have hands up from Paul as well, and then we'll get to Trevor and Della.
So, this has been very enlightening in many respects. But I think that the other issue in terms of conflict resolution that has to be addressed is that in many cases, both living shorelines or other aspects of erosion control are really intertwined with public safety or, issues related to that and sea level and erosion and moving people off of islands, et cetera. So shoreline stabilization is a critical component, and sometimes there runs into conflicts that these are either existing SAV or former SAV sites that create restrictions in the permitting process. And one, in fact, you're looking at issues related to critical infrastructure, and many of those other kinds of issues. It creates greater conflict in resolving whether or not these projects can move forward, as well as whether or not there are compensatory mitigation actions based on sort of infrastructure related issues for shoreline protection for shoreline. And so I just wanted to make sure that we often think about using living shorelines as a methodology for limiting erosion in sort of personal areas or protection of vital resources from a habitat or a natural lands perspective. But there's also a pretty big component that relates specifically to infrastructure, solidification, and some of these processes that are going on.
Excellent point. Yeah, definitely something to consider. Thanks, Paul. Trevor.
Yeah, thanks. Morning, all. Just figured I'd chime in with a report out from New Hampshire. I would probably echo what Angie and Janelle were saying from Maine as well. I think New Hampshire, for the most part, is kind of in its infancy when it comes to living shorelines. We do have a small handful of projects. They really resemble that stone sill created marsh behind it. We've had pretty good success. I was actually just out on it this a couple of months ago for some fish monitoring on one of our more successful projects, and we're seeing a greater abundance of fish on that than even next door in our reference marsh. So some good results out of that. I think we see up north some different challenges than down south for larger tidal range, and ice really hamper the ability to have this really great integration of different habitats within it. So like we can't really use oyster reefs right up against the marsh itself. We've just started tiptoeing into monitoring oysters living underneath rockweed among the rocks, but and started an experiment here in New Hampshire with that this year. But we don't see that as being a tremendous aspect of those living shorelines themselves. And similarly with SAV, I mean, with the tidal range and with the ice, generally those marshes are pulled pretty far away from the beds themselves, so we don't tend to track those kind of effects on the project and the SAV. But one other challenge that we've sort of started tiptoeing into that I'll bring up here too is that like public land versus private land. A lot of our areas are really small, so when it's much easier from a permitting standpoint, from a scope standpoint, and a scale standpoint when you're dealing with a big, large chunk of public land. But as we start moving into like, how do we start using these as a management tactic for erosion and bringing it to a private landowner? There's all of these challenges that we start seeing popping up from just the size of the area itself and the size of the project going in usually very small to permitting aspects, funding aspects, monitoring aspects. So always interested in hearing how people are getting through those challenges, especially from the lower states where you have more experience. But that's all from me. Thanks so much. Great presentations.
Awesome. Thanks, Trevor. All right, we have one last hand up for the state report out session, and that is Della.
Hi, how's it going? I just wanted to touch base on some of the New York perspective. I'm probably not the best person to touch on this because my focus really is SAV, but my supervisor, Alexa Forney, could probably speak more to this. But just based off of like the limited knowledge that I have, we do have guidance regarding living shoreline techniques and best management practices, but they are not, there's not mention of SAV and its relation to it in the guidance document. And we also recently had like new legislation pass, which is amending our environmental conservation law, which is requiring us to just encourage use of natural-based solutions over hardening shorelines. And so that's going to be via permitting decisions and public outreach and guidance. And that's kind of in its infancy stages right now. It's a good push, but yeah, there's definitely, as far as I'm aware, they're ironing out a bunch of the details because it's going to be updating some of the article regulations in order to comply with the new policy.
Great. Thanks, Stella. I appreciate it. Is there anybody else that wants to give a state update before we move into just open discussion? Anybody? Okay, so what our goal is for all of our meetings, but for this meeting as well, is to obviously put together minutes, but we'll also be putting together a report, and we'll have all of these state updates, broken down in the report. So if you think of anything after the fact that you want included, stick it in the chat or just, point it out during the discussion, or you can even email us, whatever. But if you do come up with additional state updates, just let us know and we'll make sure it gets into the report. And before we transition over to the discussion, Corey has raised his hand. Go for it, Corey.
Yes. Hi, how are you?
Hey.
Sorry, I never used Zoom before and I was trying to figure out how to put up my hand.
Oh, there you go. You did it.
I did it. Technology at its finest. So, yeah, I just wanted to bring up from the Connecticut standpoint that there are two large living shorelines that are going to be constructed in the near future. So there is opportunity for before-after control analysis for interested researchers for these two large projects. One of them is located in an extensive area of intertidal mudflat. The other one is in a natural shoreline beach environment. Both are in the city of New Haven and very busy harbors. And both are in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 linear feet. Large sill developments with sand bench planting vegetation areas behind them. So there are some opportunities there. And the state of Connecticut, DEP is also working, I should say DEEP, is also working on a thin layer placement project that was recently approved. They're also doing a before-after comparison. And that's planned to be constructed or begin work in this winter. So there are some other data collection opportunities or partnering for collaboration out there if people are interested. So I can hook up people with anybody if you're interested in those.
Great, good to know. Thank you. If you want to, will you put that in the, since you're kind of soliciting, do you want to put that in the chat and folks can respond if they?
Sure, no, I can do that.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and at this point, I mean, we're just conveying the information. We're aware of them because we've been involved in their evaluation for many years. And generally, most of our projects, when we're looking at them, we require a minimum of 5 years monitoring. In most cases, 10 to 20, usually 5 annual years, and then 5, 10, and 20 status reports. We've done that with both of the reef ball projects in Connecticut and the Thames River and the one in Stratford, which, yes, is actually, it's coming up on 17 years, and it's been incredibly successful beyond expectations in many cases. So that was quite a surprise for all of us. But there's so many great research opportunities out there for data collection and to learn, and we're always looking to try to find people that are willing to help assist in the collection of the information, because it really does inform our regulatory reviews.
Yeah, that's the hard part, right? Finding the people to collect
finding
the data.
the people and then the money to be able to
and
do
the
it.
money.
Yep.
Corey,
absolutely.
I have a quick, oh, sorry. I have a quick
No, go
question,
ahead.
Corey. Thanks. Corey, you mentioned it was really successful. How did you guys determine, like, how are you defining successful?
Well, actually, that's actually a very unique site, and there's a long history associated with it. It was an area of lead shot remediation. Basically, they went in and they took out everything on the intertidal and upper tidal shorelines down to the sediment. They ran it through washing, screening, rehabilitation, and then put all the material back on the beach. So there was nothing there except rock. To add that, there was no SAV, it was highly dynamic, and nothing could stabilize that shoreline. So the proposal was first as a small demonstration living shoreline with the reef balls, and then multiple expansions as part of that. They also looked at creating dunes with the geotubes, which failed miserably. So where the geotubes failed, the living shoreline portion with the reef balls was highly successful. A significant amount of sediment accretion in a very, very dynamic environment. Very quickly established tidal wetland vegetation, reached equilibrium. It's almost about 80 to 85% vegetated now, and a significant amount of upper intertidal interface is basically fairly stable, where before it was just an escarped buff, area that was falling in. They have tried some different other things, such as oyster castles, which have not been as beneficial, basically because of the energetic environment there. But they have looked at other things as well.
So when you started the project, was there sort of a definition of what you would say, like, this would be, we've succeeded? Was it just to have the vegetation? Was it a certain cover? Like, I was just curious if there was metrics going in.
Well, we didn't actually, we permitted the project. So we're not the researchers, but we worked with the researchers to identify the best metrics to be able to monitor them. And ultimately what we were looking for was sediment accretion. That was the most important aspect of this project. Because there was no sediment left in this environment as a result of the remediation. So that was the key component. And then the rest of it was, well, can we reestablish that intertidal connection between water and land continuum? Can we establish something that's going to enhance the ecological environment? And I do have reports to that effect. I'm willing to share them with anybody who's interested in them, but that has basically been one of the poster childs for very few projects we've had in the upper northern extents of New England. We have not had a large number of projects. Probably, I think I've been involved in maybe 6 or 7 of them. But when it comes to it, we're still in our infancy, and we're learning from you. You folks down there have a lot more opportunity with the number of projects that you've had to review and learn from. So we're just trying to find something that's going to work within our more difficult northern climate.
Thanks, Corey. Jamie, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Corey was saying. One of my colleagues and part-time graduate students works at Sacred Heart University and has been instrumental in monitoring and kind of nurturing that site. They do LIDAR surveys every year, on the ground LIDAR surveys to look at the sediment accretion over time. We've also put out sediment sampling plates. Sacred Heart University does transects of the vegetation every year. They also do some horseshoe crab monitoring and monitoring. They count like oysters on the reef or mussels on the reef balls. So there's a lot of work that goes into it. And the person I'm referring to is Jo Marie Casanak, because she's kind of made this the center point of her PhD project. So she's looking for when does this site reach parity with a natural fringing marsh? In Connecticut, we're very rocky, and this marsh does not act like the kind of beautiful marsh platforms that you guys get. We get these rocky marshes, and so she's comparing the Stratford restoration to a nearby fringing marsh that has been established for a while in the same river, the Housatonic River. So we're looking, or she's looking for things like, is the carbon sequestration rate similar among the sites? Do we see the same community at the site? And that includes things like the vertebrate fish visiting the site. They've done some bird surveys, some horseshoe crab surveys. And so they're looking for, when do we reach parity with the ecosystem services provided with a natural marsh that this is comparable to? In earlier work, we do have a larger kind of a more older marsh platform, the kind of traditional mucky, wonderful marsh sediment. And we were including that originally, and then backed out of that because we realized it wasn't really a good comparison. We were getting extremely different results. Some of those preliminary results are out in a report that was funded by CIRCA, which is our Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. And that's what we're looking for. We also reference the NROC guidelines for monitoring living shorelines. At the time, they were just in draft form and are since now they're published. And so we were using some of the metrics included in that NROC guidance for assessing these shorelines.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
All right, so we are now moving into the discussion part of today's meeting. And so this could be, anything y'all want to talk about. I think Z and Brooke and I have always kind of kept in mind this is a broader collaborative, and we want to talk about what you want to talk about. So, is there anybody who has a discussion point that's kind of brought up earlier that we kind of skipped over that you would like to kind of spend more time on? Now is the time with this group to get into that.
And I'll also put in the chat, I created just a Google sheet for right now with the questions that we received from the presenters, as well as some of them that I've heard while people were presenting. So you can certainly add questions to that list. As Brooke said, one of the goals is that we are identifying where these data gaps are as potential projects for us to pick up on, or potential non-gaps, meaning that there's projects that potentially we've done, maybe not in the published literature and the gray literature, which is why Megan's been busy with her interviews. So by all means, add to that list as well.
Is there anything on that you guys would like to talk about first? If not, we can kind of start going through those again, just as starting points, but. All right. I guess the one that I would, okay, yeah, Pam, please go ahead.
Hold on. Trying to turn on my video. There we go. This has been fascinating for me to sit and listen. Thanks for Brooke for forwarding. I am not an SAV person. I'm a wetlands ecologist. Does a lot of work with living shorelines, and so it's just sort of interesting. And I'm not really representing SAV people in Virginia, so I don't want to mislead anybody. But I work in a regulatory context sort of policy space. And so I think one of the things in Virginia that's interesting is SAV is actually written into our water quality standards. And so when we talk about avoiding impacts, we are legally, I mean, like literally, you get into anti-degradation and all the things that go with water quality impact. So it's sort of a different kind of critter here in terms of our regulatory space. But I've heard lots of conversation about the potential risk and adverse impacts. And I think one thing that might be important to consider is maybe potential uplift. So while aerial extent or direct impacts may occur, if living, like obviously if a living shoreline or a breakwater system is placed literally on top of SAV, which as we all noted legally isn't really allowed, but might occur if there's like a mitigation process to offer. So then what might be some of the synergistic uplift between having those systems next to each other? We know that in nature, they often co-occur in a fairly close space. And Megan Fitzgerald sort of teed this up, also talking about then the riparian buffer. And so one of the things about wetlands is their relative import based on their landscape position. And so something to think about when we're talking about living shorelines is the denizens that like to live in living shorelines, blue crabs, I'll use as an example, are documented habitat, that for living shorelines for tidal marsh, but also documented habitat for SAB. So I just wanted to sort of maybe consider a positive spin here. And when we're just sort of considering these things and talking about them. So I readily acknowledge that there can be and probably are adverse impacts, but I'm just sort of, I don't know, just trying to tease that up a little bit. So I'll stop with that.
Hey, Pam, that's a good point, right? I think at this point there's a lot of unknowns, and so some of those could definitely be some positive impacts as well to keep in mind when we're moving forward. Anybody else want to build off of that, or anything you thought we haven't brought up yet that you'd like to discuss?
I was trying to figure out how to raise my hand, but I'm going to raise my hand here.
That works.
Two things that the Long Island Sound Eelgrass Collaborative are that we're going to be discussing at our December meeting, which is December 5th. And Jamie, if you're still on, I cannot get our website on my screen to be up and running. But if you could copy that Eelgrass Collaborative page and put it in the chat, that would be great for everyone to link to. Thank you. Yeah, the two topics that might be of interest to everyone is that we, our Connecticut Reserve, had an effort over the summer to put together a white paper that is compiling information and guidance based on research and conversations with state agency staff on kind of protocols for interstate seed transport for restoration purposes. And basing that on kind of like a view of moving seed within Long Island Sound and some of the concerns and potential challenges and benefits of bringing seed from the South Shore of Long Island or outside of Long Island Sound into Long Island Sound, and what what are some of the concerns related to that, and what are some of the existing processes from a state agency perspective to help research practitioners understand that seed transport topic. And so some collaborative members in the Long Island Sound Eelgrass Collaborative are going to be reviewing that white paper in November, and we're going to be talking about it at our December 5th meeting. The other thing I just wanted to mention, because at the beginning of your call today, you did mention, I think it was Jesse, that you were going to not be moving the topic of surveying aquaculture eelgrass interaction you're not going to be moving that topic forward, at least in the short term, but we are considering ways to do that in Long Island Sound with Connecticut Sea Grant, at least for the Connecticut portion of our bi-state effort. And so we can update you about that maybe in the beginning of 2025 and how that's moving forward. But one of the priorities that we heard at our June collaborative workshop was to better understand this eelgrass aquaculture interactions topic. And so we're trying to think of ways to maybe move some survey effort forward in Connecticut that could be based on some of Jill Carr's work and survey work that she presented on, I think, at your spring meeting. And so we might be moving that topic forward in Long Island Sound, and we'll just kind of keep you updated as we develop that a little bit further.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, we had 2 respondents when we recirculated the aquaculture survey. So I'm glad if anyone else still has that as a burning topic. It's definitely still an impactful one here in New Jersey. So be looking for that.
And we'll definitely leave that survey on our website if you want to use it in the future for any reason.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, Megan, your hand is up next.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to sort of tee off something Pam just said, to bring it back to one of my asks. If anyone has any examples or people to talk to about how to engage across agencies when there are conflicts to natural resources, I'd really be interested in using my project to highlight those examples. So particularly, in Maryland, we have the Corps, EPA, NOAA, NIMS, and sort of we're dealing with projects below mean high water. Then you also have the state that sort of MDE, their regulation, what they regulate overlaps, but then they're split between a tidal and non-tidal. And then you have the coastal critical area zone that regulates above mean high water, but sort of at a holistic watershed scale, perspective. We're all talking about very near shore adjacent projects that, it's hard to have those conversations because you get stuck in a regulatory space. Like, these are my 12 days or 30 days, and I can only talk about these resources that are outlined in this regulation because otherwise I'll be shut down or not. So it would be great if anyone and other states have found ways to either have those conversations early. How do you have that? Is it at a watershed scale? So you come together every couple of years, set up a plan. Is it project by project? Do you have monthly meetings? That would be something. And Megan Spindler from the Corps mentioned, Corps and MDE have put together these, I think, quarterly meetings to really talk about living shorelines. So yeah, just looking for opportunities to highlight what's working. Thanks.
Thank you, Megan. Appreciate that. And I, we'll be sure to share and connect directly with you with any information if people have that. Woody, you're next.
Hi, Woody Francis, Corps of Engineers Regulatory Branch in Baltimore. Megan, great segue. I was just trying to get to that a little bit in that Sam's slide that showed that scarp shoreline and the SAV with the riprap, not using that as the example, but where you have a more landward opportunity to consider, let's say if there's a 16-foot encroachment with a project to go channelward, but yet it would make sense to do something on the landward side, but the applicant's not necessarily considering that because he hasn't been led down that path. Where then after the fact of a 16-foot channelward encroachment project, we find that the applicant decided to do something on the landward side that could have helped contribute to that overall project goal, purpose, improving water quality and whatnot, without the corresponding 16-foot channel encroachment. Maybe it only needed to be 8 feet channelward, and therefore you can limit and minimize the impacts by simply balancing where it makes sense, with that landscape position being relatively flat and low, where the applicant could consider a more landward transition of wetland type areas in plantings or other vegetative plantings to improve water quality, and not necessarily encroach into the resource. So it's a balance between what the applicant gets and what they're also considering losing when we hear argument back, well, it's a living shoreline project, we're not trying to go back into the uplands. Well, it makes sense in some cases where the uplands are compromised over a period of time. They're screaming for a mitigation or an opportunity to be more blended into the landscape. It may happen after the fact with the permit process, because there is a reluctance to consider some of that more landward consideration, relative to the permit process. And so we're just trying to suggest that needs to happen, as Megan pointed out, in a more landscape, more wide scale perspective, and not limited to just the individual interest of that property owner trying to deal with that erosion piece, and being encouraged somewhat to go channelward to whatever degree necessary that compromises not only the SAV, but those living resources and shallow water habitats that we don't know the value of what we're conceding by issuing these permits relative to the encroachment. Not to say they're negative, we're just saying we need to be considered what's happening, and there is quite a few of them going out there. So thank you for your time. Great presentations. And Brooke, thanks so much for turning us on to this great format.
Thanks, Woody. It's a great point. And again, it's sort of thinking outside of just our one interest, is why I think it's great that we have folks here that are not just super SAV focused this week, because that really helps add the discussion. Has anybody had any luck working sort of like across, like adding an upland component into any of the stuff that you guys are currently working on, that wants to share anything? Or any other component as well?
I'll share. We haven't done it yet, but this is the planning that we're doing at the state park, is including an upland component for that parking lot that's flooding, that we want to revert to a marsh, then moving some of the parking lot upland a little bit, but then also restoring some upland area because it's heavily infested with invasives. So I could answer you in about 4 years.
I think we're all very cutting edge this week with cutting edge questions. Okay. Thanks, Jamie. Becky, your hand's up.
Yeah. So I'm aware of several projects in Maryland that have incorporated some like stormwater management aspects in the upland above, like kind of going into a living shoreline project. So often this will involve a planting area and sort of like a miniature regenerative stormwater conveyance that will route water from the upland into the living shoreline area. And I could get you like specific examples if you're interested. I don't have monitoring data specifically. Although actually, yes, I do. I have monitoring data for one of those projects. They appear to work well, but I don't have that sort of parsed out, like what that upland water management component did compared to the wave-driven erosion management component. But happy to share information.
Thanks, Becky. I do know of one who just started in North Carolina, around the Battleship, North Carolina. That area, that island is flooding all the time, and so they're actually, as part of the design, they're conceding some of the parking lot area and actually encouraging that sort of part to flood through living shorelines. And there's no SAV around it, so I haven't been paying attention. But there are active research on that. So I can look into that a little bit more and bring it back, since we're broadening our scope, which is good for this project, for this topic. Yeah, anything else do you all want to we have about 12 more minutes before we're slated for the next thing, but if there's not a lot of discussion, we can move forward for sure. So is there anything else you guys want to talk about, or while we're here?
I will say that at Ray, there was a presentation on that battleship project, and it was really interesting what they're doing with like with the whole redesign. And I think they've coined it like living with water instead of fighting against it. And lots of really cool, innovative stuff to deal with. Like I think it was flooding. The whole parking lot was flooding twice a day, every tide. And it's great to see that type of innovation going into shoreline projects, like really broad scale. That's a big project. And yeah, I'll be interested to see how it works out in the long run too. So maybe we can get that's Dawn York. Maybe we can get her to present one day.
I think you have an in with Dawn. So yeah, we'll have to, I should have thought about that, but sorry. Megan.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to piggyback off of Woody's comment. So a lot of these projects, and I keep bringing it back to sort of our small scale residential projects, just because of the sheer quantity of those that are authorized in Maryland, and there really are a lot of them. And I think what Woody was pointing to, not to take the words out of his mouth or anything, is not necessarily projects where there's like a nice stormwater management component factored into it, but in Maryland we see a lot of projects that could be that where erosion it appears that erosion could be addressed by doing management in the uplands and not going channelward. And there's still I think, some work to do on the human dimensions side of things with living shorelines in Maryland. I think an interesting thing happened when the living shoreline law got implemented in Maryland, where people who were used to building revetments, now they have to build living shorelines. And so what this is all anecdotally, I didn't do the survey or anything, but what it seems to have happened is that there's a real kind of reluctance to rely on just kind of grading back a bank, planting, and seeing if that works before kind of going into a more robust hybrid living shoreline design. So in very, very low energy systems, we're getting fairly substantial sills with lots of backfill. And it's not clear that in those situations it's necessary, that level of impact, and it's not clear that the functional uplift is really there for the kinds of projects that are being designed. So I just kind of wanted to add that context that we see the big standard individual permit projects with lots of grant funding and all that stuff that have kind of substantial impact to SAV, but there's sort of a death by 1,000 cuts that happens, I think, on the small living shoreline side of it too, where maybe there's some work to do, like I said, again, on the human dimension side, just convincing people that you don't need to go channelward, or exploring that and seeing if that's really necessary in the first place, and then provide that information to the Corps to kind of justify that. So that's all.
So I just wanted to bring up the point that Megan just made, that most of you all probably don't realize this. So in Maryland, one of the reasons we have so many living shorelines is that we have a law in place, and I have no idea when it went in, maybe 2008, that says that, if you are going to do a shoreline erosion control project, you have to do a living shoreline, if at all possible, right? I might be simplifying that, but living shorelines are the first option that you have to explore. Sometimes they're not permitted for whatever reason, but we required them, and we required them before we know what sort of impact they had on any other resources. So there's a lot of science into living shoreline design at that point, kind of, but there was not a lot of science going on about the impacts of living shorelines, good or bad. So they just seemed like a great design alternative. So we made it a law. So we're seeing that, come back, not to bite us in the butt at all, but it's a thing that we're grappling with, that it is required now. And I think it's good that it's required, but implications.
And then, so I really don't want to talk for MDE. I used to work for them, but we have Michaela and Miles on the line too from MDE. One thing I will say is that a further complication of that is the definition of a living shoreline in Maryland. There's the DNR definition of a living shoreline. There's also the MDE's definition, regulatory definition of non-structural stabilization method, I think, which requires that a living shoreline be dominated by tidal wetland vegetation. So that's where this fill comes in. is that in most cases, that's interpreted to be a 2-to-1 ratio of stone sill to vegetation. So it sets up a situation where kind of by necessity, there needs to be some fairly substantial width of marsh that's created behind a sill. Whereas there are some living shoreline techniques out there where you can kind of put the hybrid or the structural component in and let that sand accumulate. That isn't always feasible from a regulatory context, and it puts the Corps in a position of evaluating alternatives that are feasible, including feasible from a state regulatory standpoint, right? So it's nuanced. Like I said, regulatory is complicated, but I wanted to throw that out there, but that's kind of what we're dealing with here.
Thanks, Megan.
Jason, your hand's up.
There we go. No, I was just going to say to Brooke's earlier point, Brooke Landry, I'm not sure if that's entirely true, because the 2008 law, the infusion of that came from the academic community with regard to the summits in the Bay States. Maybe Pam knows others, but I don't think they were just throwing a cookbook out on the street. So where we're at now, we're talking about infusing, state of science into these regulatory, and policy stuff. I think that did occur prior to the 2008 law. And I do think that Maryland wasn't the first state. When I was talking with folks, been in this community practice for much longer than myself. That's just kind of my general consensus. So yeah, we've kind of fast forward over decades to where we are, but I think there were a lot of living shoreline summits, VIMs, many folks involved in that before the 2008 law. But I guess if Megan Spindler said there's folks from the state on, they might be able to address that.
Yeah, sorry. I oversimplified that. Apologies. Which I do.
No, I know. I know what you're getting at, but I'm just saying, because I wasn't aware either, and I realized there were all, like, many people told me no, there was a lot that went into what that, and that kind of where we're at today.
Yeah, obviously to become law, there had to have been a great deal of background, but I think maybe I'm thinking more in terms of impacts to SAV, how those interactions were going to play out, and a lot of times SAV is just not considered in the general shoreline alteration discussion. So that's more along those lines. Go ahead, Pam.
I would actually sort of agree with that characterization that SAV wasn't as much of a driver but as I said, so what we ended up with is a situation where requiring living shorelines, but then also not allowing for any SAV impacts means that sometimes the projects aren't exactly designed to fit the conditions. And so then we have unhappy customers who then speak poorly about living shorelines. And that is not because the science doesn't know how they should be done. It's an avoidance thing. And so I actually, personally, I think we might have to impact SAV sometimes in order to do the right living shoreline. But I would note this. I think that one of the interesting things we need to be able to monitor for and understand is when you build that marsh plain form, and it takes a long time before a man-made marsh develops the really dense organic matter peat basis, right? So like that really dense mat. Do those areas, though, create opportunities for SAV to come into? And I will point out that, and the name always goes out of my head. All right, the Big Marsh Restoration Complex in Alexandria, Virginia, which is loaded with SAV, and there was going to be SAV impacts in order to replace some of the marsh units that they're planning. And I know I should not.
Is that the Dike Marsh?
Dike Marsh, yep.
Is that it?
Okay. So I will note that in naturally occurring situation, the SAV was happy to occupy the area that the marsh evacuated. So I don't know if that occurs every time, and it might be somewhat species specific. Those are fresher SAV, that's like Valsinaria and some of the fresher species, right? So I'm not positive if Zostro do the same thing, but I do. But again, that was sort of why I was talking before about the interplay between these two environments. That sometimes when we try to overmanage for either one, we end up as losers. I guess it's just trying to find an elegant way of saying that. So.
Yeah, it gets really tricky. And because the law went into place before we knew how all of these resources interacted, we can't effectively do the trade-off, the habitat like trade-off valuation at this point. So, and without being allowed to impact SAV, we can't do the studies to show what the impact on SAV is. So it's all just it's tricky.
Yeah, I
Megan's
was going
got
to say the
her hand
same
up.
thing. It's the idea that where the shorelines need to go in, at least in New Jersey, if there's seagrass there, then it's a stumbling block. It's viewed as a complete kind of stop for some of the effort, when in fact there's something needs to happen to preserve the shoreline, and in a lot of the cases the homes, because the homes in Barnegat Bay are right up against the water in some of these spots. So it's kind of a requirement that they be interacting, and trying to get enough data out of it is really one of the larger concerns. Is a preliminary survey that's just whether or not you're going to have to mitigate for the loss is not going to give, from the SAV research side, the answers that a lot of the things that we're looking for on that list came about from this. And the other issue that came out of the Ray session as well is just the idea of the monitoring and the fact that SAV just fluctuates so much. I mean, and I'm speaking more like eelgrass and rupia, widgeon grass are the two ones that we have here, but you'll have it one year and not the next. And so at what point do you stop? Has your funding run out that you're not surveying anymore versus you're just generally interested, still surveying? And that site that you mentioned, Brooke, where it was there, and then you read in the literature and went back and it was back again. And how long will that actually be a persistent bed? And is the seed bank there to support it? The monitoring I find has been really I've struggled to find enough literature that's monitored for a sufficient amount of time, given how stochastic these populations are. So, yeah.
And as we know, these projects frequently don't include funding for long-term monitoring. So that's a problem too.
Were there any sort of final thoughts on the discussion before we move to my favorite way to end the meeting, just all the good things people are doing? So any final thoughts before we move it on?
So there is in the chat, Michaela pointed out that MDE does allow for SAV impacts. You just have to avoid and minimize before you get your permit license to do the work. But there's a 5-year composite look back where we look at SAV presence in those last 5 years, and sometimes in Maryland, at least we do allow for SAV impacts, which is what it has made it, the last couple of years easier for me. Although the project hasn't really worked out, but for me to actually look at SAV impacts in that before after study from Living Shorelines. So, and Pam said same in Virginia. Although they do a 10-year composite. That's impressive. That's good.
Yes, and those of us outside of the VIM survey area hate you both. No, that's great. I do like how that's included in those areas. So what any other thoughts on this? And it's been a really great and very interesting discussion that I think has gone just places I didn't expect. Pam?
Yeah, I think it's been a great conversation too. And like I said, I think that there's so many other complicated, so obviously the SAB story, like the wetland story, is very complicated by lots of other drivers and potential impacts. And we certainly don't want to complicate or make it harder to reach some of our SAB goals due to shoreline protection. But, there's going to be hard choices to have to be made. And I do think I pointed out, and for whoever's benefit and whoever's going to grab the chat, quite a while ago at this point, there were a couple projects permitted in the lower bay on the eastern shore. Now, those are very rich sediment areas, and somebody talked about SAV and sediment, and I know SAV actually doesn't necessarily mind some sediment movement. And these were sandy shorelines, but I do know that one of those was permitted a long time ago, and there was a huge conversation about the direct impact at the One Ridge project anyway, and not long after, unfortunately, nobody officially monitored it, but after the original direct impact, the area, actually, I think Eva Marie might have noted this, that the area, actually, the SAB areas got bigger. Now, of course, we also know that there's somewhat of an ephemeral element to some of these beds. The really dense populated beds that have been in place for a long time tend to persist, but the sort of smaller ones come and go. And so I think that also makes it really complicated to attribute those changes maybe to any particular one cause. But I really love the conversation, and I hope that we can continue to sort of look at those things across shorescapes, across the so that we continue to hopefully provide the science to support well-informed decision making, so that we can maximize our benefits. Those two systems really support all of our commercial fisheries. So without them, we're in a tough place. That I just wanted to say that real quick.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. And I do want to ask that we don't really know as far as I've seen it, there's not a lot of literature out there or understanding of the role of these more ephemeral meadows and what they play with the resilience in our systems to other changes with the more continuous meadows, and and then how do we then incorporate that into management? It's always a tricky one. So I think it kind of highlights again that we need to get more understanding within our communities about the role of some of these more ephemeral meadows in the long-term structure. All right, so this has been a really great conversation. And I do also, though, want to give everybody time to kind of highlight some of the member updates. So this is a chance we give you guys in our agenda where you get a chance to highlight anything that's been done that's not necessarily related to this topic at all. So any kind of like fun things that you want to point out or things you want to share with the group to kind of get more awareness of it, now is the time. So just raise your hand and we'll start out. And it doesn't have to be anything super formal. It can be like, we got this funded, or the thing got built. So any of those things work. Eric.
Hey, Jesse, thanks. Just a general update. So during last week's Atlantic Coast Fish Habitat Partnership, and I'll drop this in the chat afterwards, so you guys can check out what that partnership is if you're not familiar with it. The Science and Data Committee was considering a number of aspects related to SAV restoration, and they decided to prioritize work to try to generally support seed-based SAV restoration. And their first priority focuses on developing a guidance document, kind of coastwide guidance document to inform state and regional seed transfer policies and agreement. And so I think the goal or the approach here, they'll be working to evaluate really the specific process or path forwards. It might include a future workshop, but I think the important elements are they're really looking to complement, and leverage the expertise from these regional collaboratives like the East Coast SAV, the Long Island Collaborative, all of the partners that either participate here or are really active in this space. And, certainly leverage information from the ongoing seed policy transfer work that Long Island Sound is leading. And there might be others. That's just the one that I'm aware of. So we'll be reaching out to some folks directly. However, if you're interested in participating in this, or you just want more information, or you want us to know and ensure that there's folks that you're aware of that are working on this, interested in this, you can just drop us their line and volunteer them. Just email either myself or Simon Kalstead, who's the Atlantic Coast Fish Habitat Partnership Coordinator. And I'll drop this in the chat in just a minute.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. It's great. Anybody else? Okay, well, I'll give one. This will encourage other people. My former master's student just got her paper published on halidonia reddii cold tolerance in comparison with North Carolina, which is the northern limit throughout its range. So that's something we're excited to get that out, because halidonia in North Carolina is very different than other places. So it's good to see that moving forward. It's hard to believe that a group of this many awesome people doesn't have anything else cool going on.
I did mail you some seagrass yesterday.
Oh, I was going to ask you. Thank you. Paul.
Yeah, we just had two papers come out in the last 12 months looking at population genetics in eelgrass in New Jersey, looking at actually tracking over time, especially with respects to the impacts of Hurricane Sandy a decade ago, or I guess 12 years now, looking to see actually how it shifted population structure and actually massively increased genetic diversity in the plant community overall, just because of a lot of clearing of large beds and then subsequent, movement of and germination of seedlings and massive sort of reproductive structures, leading to higher diversity within those systems. And we've got another one that's just been submitted, looking at a similar relationship of sort of tracking genetics and populations in restoration efforts, as well as within populations broadly.
Great, thanks, Paul.
There's some other great ones in the chat. And also people reaching out as far as if you want to connect, just realize if you have literature that you've been recommending or suggesting, you put it in the chat. We'll populate a list and post that, as well as the recording from the meeting. So don't feel like you're trying to frantically copy or connect with people. We do facilitate that once we've closed out the meeting. But if there is anything else resources wise from the presentations, please make sure you drop that in the chat so that we've got it. And then I think, Brooke, I saw you ask about the presentations too. So hopefully we'll have those to share.
Yeah. Yes, Susan. Oh, you're still muted.
So I work with middle school and high school students in Massachusetts, and I have taken students out on a rising tide and had them build sandcastles against the rising tide. And hearing all of the living shoreline designs makes me want to come up with a kit that's like a reinforced advanced educational sandcastle building suitcase. And so I'm asking if anybody would like to brainstorm with me on what that might include. I think it would be fun for students to try playing with some of the structures that living shorelines and revetments and everything use, and seeing what happens with sediments just on a small scale as the tide comes in on the local flats. So if anybody would like to brainstorm with me on that, I think it'd be fun to make something and then maybe make it distributable to other educational institutions on the shore. It's a bit limited in that it has to be shore based, but unless you use hoses or something. But anyway, I'm at the Center for Student Coastal Research, and I'll put my email in the chat.
Awesome, thank you. I think I would love to be in that class. That'd be great. Yeah, and I would, adding to the list of things we can deliver as a collaborative, I think any educational outreach type materials, like that's awesome to share, and I'd love to do more of that as well. So please reach out to Susan.
So one of the things that Caitlin is working on are educational materials for SAV. So she's doing kind of lesson plans and activities. I'm not sure if Caitlin's still on. She's not feeling well today. But she is making lesson plans and activities for elementary, middle, and high school age blocks. So we'll get those out in, probably a year or so. They have to like go through review and whatnot. But we would love to collaborate with, Sam, if you've got environmental education stuff, and everybody else that has expressed interest in that. Any sort of collaboration on educational materials involving SAV would be great.
And I'm happy to test those, like field test them with students.
Oh, that'd be amazing. Thank you.
Angie.
Following on the topic of educational materials, there's a group in Casco Bay, southern part of Maine, that just did a pilot study for seeding, and it's the first seeding, I believe, that's been done in Maine. And there's a nice story map that's in draft status right now, and I can share it once I get permission from the project manager. But it details the work they've done with looking at seeding, at flowering phenology, removal of seeds, germination in a lab setting. And this is really new for Maine and exciting. So we'll be monitoring over the winter and into the spring the success of that pilot project. But this will be documented in a story map that I can share maybe in January at the next meeting. And the methods used for the seeding were hand casting and incorporation of seeds into tea bags, and they were staked within the plots, and then of course control plots as well. So it's exciting.
Awesome.
Cool. Great,
Yeah, looking
thanks.
forward to that. Yeah. Chris.
Here we go. Oh wait, sorry. Why is my video not turning on?
You're good.
All right. I just thought I'd share a few updates on some projects, some fun projects that we have going on. So one of these is a lab slash student project. We've been continuing our big restoration project in Burton's Bay, in the coastal lagoons of Virginia. So that's a new bay system we're working in. So we planted 38 acres using our classic seed broadcasting method last week. But we've also partnered with an engineering firm called Ulysses. And next month, we're going to be piloting with them a automated seed injection robot that just drives around. Like you program it, it just drives around and injects seeds into the sediment. And they're also going to be developing robots to test out for automated seed harvesting and seed stirring and all kinds of automation. So they've got big ideas, and so we're going to be supporting them with the Nature Conservancy. And that project's funded by Ocean Care. But we're interested in doing some comparative work. So in addition to that pilot, we've set up some experiments with manual injection and a number of different cross treatments, including co-planting with clams in different densities and sort of situations. So we'll be comparing all of these different methods, and hopefully we'll have some good pilot data to share come April. And then I'm going to plug two student projects in my lab. One, my PhD student, Allie Hall, who is, I think, on the call. If she wasn't going to pipe up, she's been doing some really cool work that I'm hoping she'll share soon at the Chesapeake Bay SAB working group on carbon stocks and how those differ between Rupia and Zostra meadows and what it means for the future climate change and carbon sequestration in the Bay. And another one of my PhD students has been doing a lot of work over the last few years on cownose ray and other ray impacts on seagrass meadows, trying to ascertain how much of a destructive force they are in the meadows, and whether there's any benefits to the bioturbation that they do. And he had a really successful field season last summer and collected over 200 high resolution flights, and has been sort of capturing information on where the rays are, when are they using the meadows, what their densities are. We can see the pit aggregation rates. So again, by the spring, I'm hoping he'll have some cool preliminary results to share on just what the rays are doing in our systems here, and what their functional importance is. So that's what's going on in Virginia, or Southern Virginia.
Chris, will you stand up and show us your shirt?
Oh yeah.
Oh my God. That's awesome.
Nice.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah.
Is the Ulysses system the same as the Grasshopper on the West Coast, or there's one in the UK? Is it all the same technology and different names?
So that name Grasshopper, that is not familiar to me, but the Ulysses company, they were based in the UK. They just relocated to San Francisco. And I know that they've been talking with folks in Australia and also in northern California and further up the coast. But then there's some other systems I've heard about for some competing companies that sound very similar. So it sounds like this space, there's a couple of different groups that are trying to develop some new methods. And it'll be really interesting. I heard, from the folks that have been in this field longer than me, that there was a big kind of bloom of similar kinds of ideas about 15, 20 years ago that didn't really pan out. But, our technology has advanced, so maybe this crop of machines will be really effective. So I'm excited to see.
There's a guy in Florida that is doing is working on drone release of seeds as well. So he's working with clam seeds right now. It's clam spat, or maybe it's oyster. I don't remember, but he wants to test it on seagrass seeds. So
okay.
If anybody's interested.
Yeah, there's harvesters too. Robots ruling the world at this point, right? AI next.
Yep.
Taylor, do you have an update, Taylor?
Hi. Just wanted to give a quick general update from Delaware, or at least Southern Delaware. Next week, we are planting about 400,000 seeds of widgeon seed at 2 separate sites in Little Assawoman Bay that we're really excited about. One of those is a reseeding from planting that we did in the summer. But we're very excitedly getting rid of about a quarter of our seed that we had collected back in May next week. So we're looking forward to that and seeing how that plays out in the spring and if it actually grows.
Awesome.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Taylor. All right, so I think we're right at 12 o'clock. So we're going to go ahead and wind this down. But I do want to say thank you all so much for your time today and for the great discussion and sharing materials and ideas. I think it's great to see the collaboration sort of forming in real time. And please we'll have the next meeting in January. And I think I missed the beginning of the meeting, but last I heard it was going to be on creating a common definition of a seagrass bed. So
yes.
awesome. We
So
will
January,
focus on that.
Yep, January defining a meadow, and then March mitigation are the next two up. So there is a document that we've started with any of your state regulations. So if you're our steering committee member, please make an entry, or even if anybody can make an entry for how it's defined. And then the March meeting would be focused on mitigation based on, that was the last from way back when we started our sticky notes of ideas. So then we'll probably in the January meeting be looking for more ideas.
And we don't have dates for those meetings yet. So that's just the general time frame. So as soon as we decide on dates, we'll send out calendar invites. All right. Well, thank you everybody for your participation today. This was a good meeting. I think at one point we had about 65 people online. So thanks for spreading the word and rallying the troops. And we'll see you next time. Jesse and Z, do you want to stay on for a minute?
Yeah, that works. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks, y'all. See you next time.